At the reading of my grandmother will my cousin Julianne inherited a $4 million estate, 2 luxury vehicles, and a 7-figure bank account. I inherited a single paper envelope sealed with red wax. The estate lawyer slid it across the mahogany table and gave me one instruction. Open this only when you are ready to face the truth. Julianne laughed, snatched the keys to the estate, and ordered me to vacate the guest house by midnight. She thought she had stripped me of everything. She did not know the paper inside my envelope dictated who owned the dirt beneath her feet. My name is Sloane. I am 30 years old, and I work as a corporate compliance specialist. Before I tell you how a single legal document destroyed my greedy family, take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time in the comments so I know where you are watching from. The air in Attorney Gregory's office felt sterile, smelling of old paper and leather polish. The rhythmic ticking of his grandfather clock echoed against the wood-paneled walls. Gregory folded the heavy parchment of my grandmother's last will and testament. He cleared his throat, fixing his eyes on the desk blotter, refusing to meet my gaze. Julianne sat across from me wearing a pristine white blazer. She let out a sharp, triumphant exhale. Her mother, my Aunt Pamela, reached over and patted her hand. They had won. The sprawling estate in the affluent hills of Connecticut, the vintage cars, the liquid assets. It all belonged to Julianne. I sat frozen in my chair. For 5 years I lived in the drafty guest house behind the main estate. I managed my grandmother's doctor's appointments, bathed her when her strength failed, and balanced her checkbooks, all while working 50 hours a week, analyzing corporate contracts. Julianne spent those same 5 years in Milan, funding a lavish lifestyle on my grandmother's credit lines, only flying back when the doctors warned us the end was near. Gregory reached into his desk drawer. He pulled out a thick ivory envelope bearing a crimson wax seal. He pushed it across the polished desk toward me. "Your grandmother left you this, Sloane," he said, his voice low and tight. "Her explicit instruction was that you open it only when you are ready to face the truth about this family." Julianne snatched the heavy brass keys to the main house off the desk. She stood up her chair, scraping harshly against the floorboards. She turned her attention to me, her eyes sweeping over my faded cardigan. "Well," Sloane Julianne said, her tone dripping with mock pity, "I suppose you will need time to figure out your living situation. I am hosting an investor dinner at the estate tomorrow night for my new boutique launch. I cannot have you hovering around the property looking like a charity case." Pamela stood next to her daughter, snapping her designer purse shut. "You heard her, Sloane? You have until midnight to pack your belongings and clear out of the guest house. Leave the keys to the sedan on the kitchen counter. My mother paid the deposit on that car, which means it belongs to Julianne now." My lungs seized. Outside the large office windows, the sky had darkened into a bruised purple, threatening a heavy autumn storm. They were stripping me of my shelter and my transportation in the same breath, leaving me stranded in the impending rain. I looked at the ivory envelope resting on the mahogany desk. I did not scream. I did not beg them for a few more days. Pleading with women who view cruelty as a sport only hands them a trophy. I picked up the wax-sealed envelope, tucked it into my coat pocket, and walked out the door. I had mere hours to salvage my life, and the real nightmare was waiting for me back at the estate. The drive back to the estate felt like a blur. Rain began to lash against the windshield of my sedan, blurring the opulent mansions lining the winding Connecticut roads. The storm had broken, matching the chaos inside my chest. I kept my eyes focused on the asphalt. I had less than 6 hours to pack 5 years of my life into whatever suitcases I could find and disappear. I pulled through the wrought iron gates of the main property and steered my car down the long gravel driveway, leading toward the small, familiar silhouette of the guest house. My headlights swept across the front lawn, illuminating a scene that made me slam on the brakes. The car skidded slightly on the wet gravel, the tires crunching to a halt. My belongings were scattered across the wet grass. Books I had collected since college, my winter coats, the small wooden jewelry box containing my mother's silver necklace. All of it had been violently hurled out of the front door of the guest house. The rain was already soaking into the pages of my ledgers. A pile of my sweaters lay in a muddy puddle near the porch steps. I threw the car door open and stepped out into the freezing downpour. Aunt Pamela stood under the covered porch of the main house, a safe distance from the rain-barking orders at 2 large men in dark raincoats. They were private security guards, the kind you hire when you want to enforce your will without involving the local police. They were dragging my mattress out the front door, tossing it unceremoniously onto the driveway. "Stop it!" I yelled, my voice cracking against the howling wind. "You said I had until midnight. I need time to pack." Julianne emerged from the main house holding a large, clear umbrella. She walked carefully down the stone path, ensuring her expensive leather boots avoided the mud. She stopped a few feet from where I stood in the rain. "Midnight was a courtesy, Sloane," Julianne said, her voice easily cutting through the noise of the storm. "But Mother and I realized we do not want your negative energy lingering on the property for another second. The estate agents are coming tomorrow morning to appraise the guest house for renovations. Your garbage is in the way." I dropped to my knees on the wet grass, frantically gathering my scattered clothes and shoving them into a cheap canvas duffel bag I found lying near the bushes. The rain plastered my hair to my face. The sheer, overwhelming cruelty of the moment threatened to paralyze me, but I forced my hands to keep moving. I had to salvage my professional documents and my identification. Julianne took another step forward. The tip of her umbrella hovered just above my head. "And do not bother packing the trunk of that sedan," she instructed smoothly. "Hand over the keys." I froze, looking up at her from the mud. "The car is registered in my name, Julianne. I pay the monthly lease. But grandmother paid the initial $5,000 down payment." Julianne countered, a cold, calculating glint in her eye. "My lawyer confirmed that any asset funded by the estate belongs to the primary heir. That vehicle is estate property. Hand over the keys, Sloane. You cannot do this," I said, pushing myself up from the ground, clutching my wet duffel bag against my chest. "I need this car to get to work tomorrow. You have 2 luxury vehicles in the garage. You do not need a leased sedan." "It is not about what I need," Julianne replied, offering a chilling, vacant smile. "It is about what is legally mine. Give me the keys, or I will have the guards report the vehicle stolen." I took a step back toward my car, a sudden, desperate urge to fight rising in my throat. I reached for the door handle. I was not going to let them strip me of my only means of transportation in the middle of a storm. Julianne snapped her fingers. The 2 security guards abandoned the mattress and closed the distance between us in seconds. One of the men, towering a full foot above me, grabbed my forearm with a grip like an industrial vice. His fingers dug painfully into my skin, twisting my arm away from the car door. "Let go of me!" I demanded, struggling against his immense weight. The second guard stepped in close, using his broad chest to block me from the vehicle. He reached down and forcefully pried the keys from my trembling fingers. I tried to pull my hand back, but the first guard twisted my arm harder, sending a sharp jolt of pain radiating up to my shoulder. I gasped, the fight draining out of me under the threat of actual physical injury. The guard tossed the keys to Julianne. She caught them with one hand, a look of profound satisfaction settling over her face. "Escort her off the property," Julianne ordered the guards, turning her back on me, "and lock the main gates." The guard released my arm, giving me a rough shove toward the long driveway. "Walk," he grunted. I stood there for a fraction of a second, the freezing rain soaking through my thin blazer. I looked at the dark silhouette of the main house, the place I had spent 5 years maintaining. I looked at Julianne retreating under her umbrella, clutching the keys to my car. They had executed a flawless, ruthless eviction. I bent down, hoisted the heavy, soaked canvas duffel bag onto my shoulder, and began the long walk down the gravel driveway. The mud sucked at my shoes. The wind whipped the rain into my eyes, blinding me. I did not look back. I listened to the heavy wrought iron gate slam shut behind me, the loud metallic clang ringing out like a final judgment. I stood on the edge of the dark, winding country road. I had no car. I had no home. I was clutching a bag of wet clothes, completely isolated in the dead of night. The physical pain in my arm throbbed, a steady reminder of the violence they were willing to employ. But tucked safely deep inside the inner pocket of my damp coat, shielded from the rain, was the wax-sealed envelope. I started walking, focusing solely on putting one foot in front of the other. The storm was raging, but a different kind of storm was beginning to brew inside my mind. The 3-mile walk along the shoulder of the county road was a test of endurance I had not prepared for. Cars sped past occasionally, their tires throwing arcs of cold, dirty water over my already soaked clothes. I did not try to hitchhike. I kept my head down, focusing the beam of my phone flashlight on the wet asphalt, guarding the heavy duffel bag slung over my shoulder. My sister Natalie lived in a modest suburban neighborhood on the edge of town, far removed from the sprawling estates where Julianne and Pamela reigned. I reached her front porch just past 10 o'clock. My teeth were chattering uncontrollably, and my hands were so numb I could barely press the doorbell. The door swung open almost immediately. Derek stood in the entryway wearing a faded college sweatshirt and dark sweatpants. He took one look at my drenched, shivering form and the muddy bag at my feet. He did not ask what happened. He simply reached out, grabbed my arm, and pulled me into the warm, brightly lit foyer. Natalie hurried down the stairs, a look of pure alarm crossing her face. She wrapped a thick wool blanket around my shoulders and ushered me into the kitchen, while Derek locked the door behind us. They handed me a mug of hot tea and waited until the violent shivering began to subside. Sitting at their kitchen table wrapped in dry clothes, I laid the facts out plainly. I detailed the lawyer office, the sudden eviction, the security guards, and the seizure of my car. Natalie's face tightened with silent, helpless anger, but Derek leaned against the counter, his expression calculating. Derek was a forensic accountant for a prominent corporate firm. He spent his days unraveling complex financial fraud and tracing hidden assets. He viewed the world through a lens of ledgers and legal liabilities. He looked at the wet coat I had draped over a nearby chair. "What did the lawyer give you, Sloane?" Derek asked, his voice low and steady. I reached into the inner pocket of the coat and withdrew the ivory envelope. The heavy red wax seal was still intact, untouched by the storm. I set it on the center of the kitchen table. The lawyer told me to open it only when I was ready to face the truth. Derek pulled a chair out and sat across from me. "Open it," he instructed quietly. I slid my thumb under the flap of the envelope, breaking the crimson wax seal with a sharp snap. I reached inside, expecting a handwritten letter, perhaps a final apology from my grandmother for leaving me at the mercy of Pamela and Julianne. I pulled out a thick folded document printed on heavy legal paper. There was no personal letter. There was no emotional goodbye. I unfolded the pages and smoothed them flat on the table. The header at the top of the document read, "Grant deed and assignment of leasehold interest." The legal jargon was dense, but as a compliance specialist, I recognized the structure of a property transfer. "It is a deed," I said, my brow furrowing in confusion. "But it is not made out to me. It transfers ownership of something to a corporate entity named Apex Holdings." Derek's eyes narrowed. He stood up abruptly and walked out of the kitchen, returning a moment later with his work laptop. He set it on the table, opened the screen, and rapidly typed his login credentials. "Let me see that document," he said, his tone shifting into full professional focus. I handed him the deed. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the legal description of the property, the parcel numbers, and the notary stamps. His fingers flew across his keyboard as he accessed a secure subscription-based public records database used for forensic auditing. "Your grandmother did not leave you a house, Sloane," Derek murmured, his eyes locked on his screen as lines of data scrolled past. "She left you a corporation." He cross-referenced the corporate registration number listed on the deed with the state database. He hit the Enter key and waited for the query to load. When the results populated on his screen, the quiet, analytical demeanor he maintained vanished entirely. He let out a low, sharp whistle, leaning closer to the monitor, as if he could not believe the data he was reading. "Derek, what is it?" Natalie asked, moving to stand behind his chair. Derek looked up at me, a mixture of profound shock and deep, abiding respect etched across his face. "Your grandmother was a tactical genius," he said softly. "She knew exactly what Pamela and Julianne were going to do. She knew they would fight tooth and nail for the estate and the liquid assets. So she let them have the bricks and the bank accounts. But she kept the ground." He turned the laptop screen toward me so I could see the corporate registry details. "Apex Holdings is a blind shell company registered 10 years ago," Derek explained, tapping his pen against the screen. "The document in your hand transfers full executive control and sole ownership of Apex Holdings to you. And according to the county parcel maps, Apex Holdings owns the ground lease for the land sitting directly underneath the main estate." My mind struggled to process the magnitude of his words. Wait. Julianne inherited the mansion, but the land it sits on belongs to this company. Exactly. Derek confirmed, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. In high-net-worth real estate, it is not uncommon to separate the structure from the land for tax purposes. Julianne owns the physical house, but she is essentially a tenant on your dirt. But that is not even the best part. He typed another parcel number into the database, pulling up a commercial zoning map of the downtown district. Apex Holdings also owns the commercial ground lease for the retail parcel on Oak Street, Derek stated, pointing to a highlighted square on the map. The address hit me like a physical blow. Oak Street was the most expensive, highly sought-after commercial real estate in the city. It was also the exact location where Julianne had just signed a massive lease to open her flagship luxury fashion boutique. She had been bragging about the prime location for months. Julianne Boutique is sitting on my land. I whispered the realization, sending a surge of electricity through my veins. Derek nodded, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of a forensic discovery. Julianne and Pamela inherited the tangible assets, but they do not own the ground beneath their feet. Your grandmother quietly severed the property rights a decade ago to build a firewall against their greed. They evicted you tonight thinking they held all the power. They have absolutely no idea that you hold the master lease for their entire existence. I stared at the heavy legal document resting on the kitchen table. My grandmother had not abandoned me. She had armed me. She had foreseen the cruelty Pamela and Julianne would inflict, and she had handed me the ultimate weapon to dismantle their empire. The cold, shivering despair that had gripped me during the walk in the rain evaporated completely. It was replaced by a sharp, calculating clarity. Derek closed the laptop screen. "What do you want to do, Sloane?" I looked at the deed. The wax seal was broken, but the power it contained was fully activated. "I need to review the terms of these ground leases," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I need to know exactly when their rent is due." I slept on Natalie guest room floor that night, the heavy legal deed folded securely inside my jacket pocket. The sheer magnitude of my grandmother's secret corporate maneuvering kept my mind racing until dawn. I needed to verify the ground lease contracts, calculate the renewal dates, and formulate a strategy with Derek. But the immediate reality of my life demanded my attention. I had a demanding job as a compliance specialist at a prestigious corporate logistics firm downtown, and missing a day of work to process a family dispute was not an option I could afford. I had heavy student loan payments, and as of last night, no permanent address. I borrowed a simple gray suit from Natalie called a ride-share service, since Julianne had seized my sedan, and arrived at the polished glass facade of my corporate office building just before 8 in the morning. I approached the security turnstile, pulled my employee identification badge from my purse, and swiped it against the scanner. A sharp, abrasive red light flashed on the small screen. "Access denied. Contact administration." I frowned, assuming it was a routine system error. I tapped the badge against the reader a second time. The red light flashed again, accompanied by a loud negative buzz that drew the attention of the lobby security guard. "Miss," the guard said, stepping out from behind his podium. "Your badge has been deactivated. Human Resources left instructions for you to report directly to their suite upon arrival." A cold knot formed in my stomach. A deactivated badge at a corporate firm never signaled a technical glitch. It signaled an execution. The guard escorted me not to my desk, but to the designated visitor elevator, riding up with me to the 4th floor, where the Human Resources Department operated behind frosted glass doors. I was led into a sterile, windowless conference room. The Director of Human Resources, a stern woman named Evelyn, sat at the head of the table. Beside her sat the Vice President of my division, a man who usually greeted me with a warm smile, but today avoided my eyes entirely. "Sloane, please take a seat," Evelyn instructed, her voice devoid of any professional courtesy. I sat down, keeping my posture rigid and defensive. "What is going on, Evelyn? Why is my badge deactivated?" Evelyn opened a manila folder resting on the table. "We received a highly disturbing phone call late yesterday evening from a member of your immediate family. The caller identified herself as Julianne, your cousin, and she stated that she was calling in her capacity as the primary executor of your late grandmother estate." The name hit the table like a live grenade. Julianne had not been satisfied with evicting me into a storm. She was actively hunting my livelihood. Evelyn adjusted her glasses and looked down at her notes. "Your cousin informed us that you are currently under active investigation by private authorities for elder financial abuse. She alleged that you systematically siphoned funds from your grandmother accounts during your time as her caretaker, and that you stole several pieces of high-value jewelry from the estate immediately following her passing." The accusation was so profoundly absurd, so violently disconnected from reality, that for a fraction of a second I could not process the words. I stared at the human resources director, waiting for the punchline of a terrible joke. Julianne is lying. I stated, my voice sharp and uncompromising. I managed my grandmother's finances meticulously because no one else in the family would do it. Every cent is accounted for in ledger books that Julianne currently possesses. I have never stolen a dime, and there is no police investigation. She evicted me last night and stole my car. This is a malicious, targeted smear campaign to ruin my life. The vice president shifted uncomfortably in his chair, finally meeting my gaze. Sloane, we value your work here. You have an impeccable compliance record. But you must understand our position. We are a logistics firm handling sensitive financial contracts for national clients. We cannot employ a compliance specialist who is accused of elder fraud and theft. The optics are a catastrophic liability. I am not accused by the authorities. I countered, leaning forward and placing my hands flat on the table. I am accused by an angry relative trying to consolidate an inheritance. Call the local precinct. Run a background check right now. You will find absolutely nothing because no crime occurred. Evelyn held up a hand, halting my defense. It is not our job to conduct a criminal investigation, Sloane. It is our job to protect the firm from reputational damage. If these allegations leak, or if a detective walks into our lobby to question you, it reflects poorly on our executive team. She slid a formal document across the mahogany table. Effective immediately, you are placed on an indefinite administrative suspension. Evelyn announced, her tone icy and definitive. This suspension is without pay. You are forbidden from contacting any company clients, accessing any corporate servers, or entering this building until this family dispute is legally resolved and your name is formally cleared of all suspicion. I looked down at the suspension notice. The bold black letters blurred slightly. They were stripping me of my income based entirely on a vindictive phone call from a woman who despised me. Julianne knew exactly how the corporate machine operated. She knew that a firm obsessed with compliance would instantly sever ties with an employee carrying the stench of financial fraud, regardless of whether the claims were substantiated. You are punishing me based on a phone call, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. You are allowing an outside party to weaponize your human resources protocols to execute a personal vendetta. Sign the acknowledgement of suspension, Sloane. Evelyn commanded, tapping a pen against the paper. If you refuse, we will transition this from a suspension to an immediate termination for cause. The vice president looked away again, choosing the safety of corporate cowardice over defending a dedicated employee. I was completely isolated in the room. I had no union representative. I had no legal counsel present. I had a mountain of student loan debt, a depleted savings account, and a sister who was generously allowing me to sleep on her floor. Julianne had executed a flawless, multi-tiered assault. She took the house. She took the car. Now she was severing my financial lifeline, ensuring I lacked the resources to hire an attorney to fight her for the estate. She wanted me broken, destitute, and desperate. She wanted to guarantee that I would never possess the power to challenge her newly acquired empire. I picked up the pen. The metal felt cold against my skin. I did not plead for my job. I did not cry in front of the executives who were so willing to discard me to protect their image. Crying is a luxury for people who have a safety net. I had nothing but the clothes on my back and the secret corporate deed folded inside my jacket pocket. I signed the suspension notice with a rapid, jagged stroke of the pen. I stood up, pushing the chair back. I will clear my name, I informed the vice president, looking him dead in the eye. But when I do not expect me to return to a firm that folds at the first sign of a fabricated rumor. I walked out of the conference room, rode the elevator down to the lobby in total silence, and pushed through the revolving glass doors. The morning air was sharp and biting. I stood on the busy Chicago sidewalk as business professionals rushed past me, holding coffees and briefcases, living the life I had just been forcibly ejected from. Julianne believed she had boxed me into an inescapable corner. She assumed that stripping me of my salary would force me to crawl back to her and beg for whatever scraps she was willing to throw my way. She believed she was playing a game of simple addition and subtraction. She did not realize that while she was busy cutting my paycheck, I was holding the deed to the very ground her luxury boutique was being built upon. The corporate sabotage did not break my resolve. It merely accelerated my timeline. Julianne wanted a war of attrition aiming to starve me out. I pulled my phone from my purse and dialed Derek number. The time for reviewing contracts passively was over. We needed to activate the Apex Holdings portfolio immediately. The counteroffensive had officially begun. I navigated the public transit system back to Natalie House, the rhythmic clatter of the train matching the frantic beating of my heart. The corporate suspension had hit hard, but it clarified the battlefield. Julianne was systematically dismantling my life piece by piece, ensuring I had no resources to mount a defense. She wanted absolute surrender. I walked the final 6 blocks from the station, the chilly autumn wind cutting through the thin material of my borrowed suit. When I unlocked the front door and stepped into the quiet suburban house, the silence was broken by the sharp, demanding vibration of my cell phone. I pulled it from my pocket. The screen displayed an incoming message from Julianne. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before swiping to open it. I expected a gloating message about my suspension, a cruel confirmation that she had successfully orchestrated my firing. What I saw on the screen made my blood run entirely cold. It was a photograph. The image was poorly lit, taken inside the grand marble-floored foyer of the main estate. Sitting on the cold stone, looking utterly bewildered and fragile, was Buster. Buster was my grandmother golden retriever. He was 12 years old, his muzzle completely white, his hips stiff with advanced arthritis. For the past 5 years, he had slept at the foot of my bed in the guest house. I had carried him up and down the porch steps when his joints ached. He was the gentle, constant companion during the long, lonely years of my grandmother's decline. He was the last living, breathing connection I had to the woman who raised me. Because animals are legally classified as property under state law, Buster had automatically transferred to Julianne as part of the general estate assets. I had begged her to let me take him the night she evicted me. She had laughed and told the security guards to lock him inside the main house. Beneath the photograph was a text message. The words were typed with a ruthless transactional efficiency. The estate accounts are temporarily frozen, pending the final tax audit. The lawyers refuse to release the liquid funds. I have a $50,000 invoice due by 5 o'clock today for the Italian marble suppliers outfitting my boutique. I know you have a personal emergency fund stashed away in your miserable little savings account. Bring $10,000 in a certified cashier check to my boutique by 3 o'clock to cover my shortfall. If you do not arrive with the money, I am taking this useless shedding animal to the city shelter to be euthanized. He is legally my property, and I have no use for a dying dog ruining my hardwood floors. I stared at the screen, reading the message again. The sheer, unadulterated malice of her demand radiated from the glowing pixels. Julianne had inherited an empire worth millions, but she was entirely illiquid. The bureaucratic machinery of estate probate had temporarily locked her out of the cash reserves. She had overextended herself on the renovations for her luxury fashion boutique, operating under the arrogant assumption that she would have immediate access to my grandmother wealth. Now, facing a critical vendor deadline that threatened to derail her grand opening, she was resorting to extortion. She knew my savings account held exactly $12,000. It was the money I had painstakingly accumulated over years of frugal living, the money intended to cover my upcoming student loan balloon payment, and now my only safety net after she orchestrated my suspension. Julianne was demanding I hand over my survival fund, and she was using the life of an innocent, loyal animal as leverage. She knew I loved Buster. She knew I would bleed myself dry to protect him. A wave of nausea washed over me. I dropped the phone onto the kitchen counter and gripped the edge of the granite surface, struggling to draw a steady breath. She was holding a hostage. She was weaponizing my empathy against me, fully aware that a threat to my own well-being would never yield the rapid, desperate compliance she required. Natalie walked into the kitchen carrying a laundry basket. She took one look at my pale, stricken face and dropped the basket onto the floor. "Sloane, what is wrong? What happened at work?" I pointed a trembling finger at the phone. Natalie picked it up, reading the message. Her eyes widened in absolute horror. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. "She is going to kill Buster." Natalie whispered, the realization hitting her with sickening force. "Sloane, she cannot do this. That is extortion. We have to call the police." I shook my head, my mind racing through the legal realities I had spent my career studying. "The police will not intervene in a timely manner." I replied, my voice sounding hollow and detached. Buster is legally classified as her personal property under the current will structure. An owner has the legal right to surrender an animal for euthanasia at a municipal shelter. If we involve the authorities, they will treat it as a civil dispute. By the time a judge issues an injunction, it will be too late. Julianne will carry out the threat simply to prove she has the power to do it. Natalie slammed the phone down on the counter, her face flushing with furious, helpless anger. She is a monster. We do not have $10,000 lying around to give her. Derek and I just paid our mortgage and our savings are tied up in the kids' college funds. How are you going to get that kind of money by 3 o'clock? I stared at the blank wall of the kitchen, the reality of my situation closing in like a physical vice. I have $12,000 in my personal savings. It is everything I have left to my name. If I give it to her, I have no way to pay my student loans. I have no way to pay you rent for letting me stay here. I have no money for food or transportation while I fight this suspension. I closed my eyes, picturing Buster's soft, trusting brown eyes, the way he used to rest his heavy head on my knee while I worked at my laptop in the guest house. He had guarded my grandmother until her last breath. I could not abandon him to a cold, terrifying death on a metal table simply to preserve my bank account. I have to pay her, I said softly, opening my eyes and meeting Natalie's gaze. I cannot let her kill him. I will go to the bank right now and request the cashier check. Natalie reached across the counter and grabbed my hand, her grip fierce and protective. Sloane, if you give her that money, she wins. She starves you out completely. You will be entirely destitute. That is exactly what she wants. She wants you broken and incapable of fighting for the estate. I know, I whispered, a single tear escaping and tracking down my cheek. I know what she is doing, but I cannot trade Buster life for a tactical advantage. He is family. I have to save him. I pulled my hand away, grabbed my purse, and retrieved my keys. I had 2 hours to reach my bank branch, secure the certified funds, and deliver the ransom to Julianne Luxury Boutique downtown. Every step I took felt like a concession, a painful surrender of my hard-earned independence. Julianne was proving that cruelty was an effective strategy, that a willingness to inflict pain granted her absolute control over the board. I opened the front door to leave the chilly autumn wind sweeping into the foyer. As I stepped onto the porch, a heavy, dark SUV pulled sharply into the driveway. The tires screeched slightly as the vehicle halted. Derek threw the driver door open and strode up the walkway. He was still wearing his tailored suit from his morning meetings, carrying his leather briefcase, his face set in a rigid, terrifying mask of complete professional focus. He took one look at my tear-stained face, and the purse clutched tightly in my hand. "Where are you going?" Derek demanded, his deep voice carrying an undeniable edge of authority. "I am going to the bank," I replied, my voice shaking. "Julianne is holding Buster hostage. She is threatening to euthanize him if I do not bring her $10,000 for her boutique renovations by 3 o'clock. I have to pay her, Derek." Derek stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He did not look surprised. He looked furious, a cold, calculated anger that radiated from his rigid posture. He walked up the steps, reached out, and gently but firmly took the car keys from my hand. "You are not going to the bank, Sloane." Derek stated, his tone brooking absolutely no argument. "And you are not giving that sociopath a single dime of your survival money." "Derek, I have to," I pleaded, the panic rising in my chest. "You do not understand the legal classification. Buster is her property. The police cannot stop her in time. If I do not pay the ransom, she will kill him." "I understand the legal classification perfectly," Derek replied, stepping past me into the house and gesturing for me to follow. "And I understand extortion. I have spent the entire morning running a forensic deep dive on Julianne and Pamela financial portfolios. I traced the vendor invoices for the boutique, the estate tax filings, and their personal credit lines." He walked into the kitchen, set his briefcase on the table, and snapped it open. Natalie stood by the counter watching her husband with wide, expectant eyes. Derek pulled out a thick stack of printed financial ledgers and spread them across the wood surface. "Julianne does not need $10,000 to cover a simple shortfall." Derek explained, his finger tracking down a column of red numbers. "She is holding your dog hostage because she is desperate. She is standing on the edge of a catastrophic financial precipice, and she needs your cash to plug a hole in a dam that is about to burst." He looked up, meeting my terrified gaze with eyes that promised absolute devastation for my enemies. "I did not let you go to the bank because we are not going to negotiate with a terrorist. We are going to destroy her leverage entirely. Come look at these documents, Sloane. You are going to want to see what Pamela and Julianne have been hiding in the dark." The kitchen table was covered in financial documents. Derek had arranged the papers with the meticulous precision of a prosecutor building an indictment. He pointed to a complex spreadsheet detailing a series of wire transfers and loan covenants. I stepped closer, my panic slowly being replaced by the cold, analytical mindset I relied on during my own compliance audits. Julianne is not a successful entrepreneur funding a luxury boutique. Derek stated, his voice a low, steady rumble in the quiet kitchen. She is operating a massive, precarious illusion built entirely on fraudulent leverage. He tapped his pen against a document bearing the letterhead of a notorious high-interest private equity firm known for predatory lending practices. 6 months ago, while your grandmother was hospitalized and alternating between states of sedation and coma, Pamela and Julianne executed a commercial loan agreement with this firm. Derek explained, tracing the path of the capital with the tip of his pen. They secured a $3 million line of credit. The boutique on Oak Street, the imported Italian marble, the designer inventory, it was all funded by this specific loan. I frowned, studying the loan origination date, but they did not have the collateral to secure a loan of that magnitude 6 months ago. Julianne had no personal assets, and the estate was still legally controlled by my grandmother. No legitimate bank would underwrite that risk. Exactly. Derek confirmed, a grim satisfaction in his tone, which is why they bypassed traditional banking institutions and utilized a private equity firm that requires tangible, immediate collateral in exchange for exorbitant interest rates. He slid a second document from the stack. It was a copy of a mortgage deed, heavily redacted in places but clear in its intent. It was the collateral agreement securing the $3 million loan. The property listed as the collateral was the main estate, the sprawling mansion Julianne had just inherited. They collateralized the loan against the estate. I read the document, the realization sending a chill down my spine. But my grandmother was still alive when this was executed. She would never have agreed to leverage the family home to fund a retail venture. She despised Julianne frivolous spending. She did not agree to it. Derek said softly, pushing the final, most devastating piece of evidence across the table. It was a magnified, high-resolution scan of the signature page of the collateral agreement. The name signed at the bottom was my grandmother, but the handwriting was glaringly incorrect. The loops were too perfectly formed, lacking the slight characteristic tremor my grandmother had developed in her later years. The pressure of the pen strokes was uniform and aggressive, unlike the faint, deliberate script of a woman in her late 80s. I stared at the forged signature. The breath left my lungs in a sharp, quiet exhale. Pamela forged my grandmother's signature on the mortgage collateral documents while she lay dying in the hospital. I whispered the sheer audacity and criminality of the act, rendering me momentarily speechless. Derek nodded slowly. It is a textbook case of mortgage fraud and elder financial exploitation. A federal crime carrying severe mandatory minimum sentencing. They executed this fraudulent loan under the assumption that your grandmother would pass away shortly, allowing Julianne to inherit the estate and legitimize the collateral before the lenders ever discovered the forgery. Natalie, standing behind me, placed a hand over her mouth. "They are felons." She breathed, her eyes wide with shock. "My aunt and my cousin are federal criminals." The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with terrifying clarity. Julianne arrogance, the sudden violent eviction, the desperate attempt to extort $10,000 from my savings. It was not merely cruelty. It was a frantic, escalating panic. The private equity loan carries a predatory maturity clause. Derek continued tapping the original loan agreement. The principal balance of $3 million is due in full within 30 days. Julianne believed she would have access to the liquid estate funds by now to pay it off, but the probate process and the standard tax audits have frozen those accounts. He leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. She is completely illiquid, facing a massive default. If she defaults, the private equity firm will seize the estate. During the seizure, their legal team will undoubtedly audit the original collateral documents. The forgery will be exposed. So she is trying to sell the estate quickly. I deduced the strategic landscape coming into sharp focus. She needs to liquidate the physical property to a third-party developer, use the proceeds to pay off the fraudulent loan, and sweep the forgery under the rug before the private equity firm audits the paperwork. Yes, Derek confirmed. I tracked an active negotiation between Julianne legal representatives and Titan Development, a massive commercial real estate conglomerate. Titan is offering $5 million for the estate property. Julianne intends to sign the final purchase agreement at her boutique launch gala tomorrow evening. If she signs that contract, she secures the funds to cover her tracks, and she walks away clean. I looked down at the forged signature on the table. The situation had escalated far beyond a petty family dispute over an inheritance. My aunt and cousin had weaponized my grandmother's final days, committing federal fraud to build a luxury empire. They were currently standing on a crumbling bridge, and I held the only tool capable of dismantling it completely. But what about Buster? Natalie asked, her voice tight with worry, breaking the intense analytical silence in the kitchen. She is still threatening to kill him at 3 o'clock today if Sloane does not pay the $10,000. We have the proof of their fraud, but we cannot use it to stop her right now without tipping our hand and allowing them time to destroy evidence. Derek looked at me, his expression softening slightly. He understood the agonizing tactical dilemma. Releasing the evidence of the forgery prematurely to the authorities would initiate a slow, bureaucratic investigation. It would not yield an immediate injunction to save a dog sitting in a municipal shelter. We cannot involve the authorities yet. I stated, my voice devoid of any hesitation. The moment Julianne suspects we have uncovered the forgery, she will expedite the sale to Titan Development or attempt to flee the jurisdiction. We need to trap her in a public setting where she cannot orchestrate a cover-up. I reached for my purse, retrieving the ivory envelope containing the Apex Holdings ground lease deed. I placed the wax-sealed document on the table next to the forged mortgage agreement. Julianne believes she possesses the authority to sell the estate to Titan Development, I said, tracing the edge of the heavy paper with my index finger. But she cannot execute a legitimate commercial real estate transaction without securing the rights to the ground lease. Titan legal team will demand proof of land ownership before finalizing a $5 million purchase. Derek smiled a slow, predatory grin that mirrored the intensity of my own resolve. "And you own the ground," he said softly. "Julianne is holding Buster hostage to extort $10,000 because she believes I am a terrified, destitute victim with no leverage." I continued, my gaze fixed on the documents. I am going to walk into her luxury boutique. I am going to face her surrounded by the investors she is desperately trying to impress. And I am going to secure Buster release. How? Natalie asked, genuine fear coloring her tone. "If you do not bring the cash, she will follow through on her threat, Sloane. She is ruthless enough to do it. I will not bring cash," I replied, picking up the Apex Holdings deed and carefully sliding it back into my jacket pocket. "I will bring compliance. Julianne wants to play a game of legal leverage. I am going to give her exactly what she demands, wrapped in a contract she is too arrogant to read properly." I turned to Derek. "I need you to draft a specific legal document for me, a family waiver and release of claims. It needs to look incredibly official, utilizing dense, intimidating boilerplate language. The document must state that I, Sloane, formally waive any and all future claims against the estate of my grandmother, and that I surrender all rights to contest the inheritance distributed to Julianne." Derek frowned, his analytical mind struggling to grasp the strategy. "You want to sign away your right to sue her for the estate. Why would you offer her that kind of blanket immunity? Because it is the only currency more valuable to her than $10,000 right now," I explained. "Julianne needs absolute certainty that I will not interfere with her impending sale to Titan Development. She knows I was my grandmother's primary caretaker. She fears I might file a civil suit challenging the will based on undue influence, which would freeze the probate process and ruin her timeline for paying off the fraudulent loan." I leaned closer to the table. "If I offer her a signed, notarized waiver, guaranteeing I will not contest her inheritance of the physical estate or the liquid assets, she will eagerly accept it in exchange for the dog. She will view it as a total humiliating surrender on my part." Derek's eyes widened as the brilliance of the loophole dawned on him. He picked up his pen, a look of profound respect crossing his face. "But the waiver will only surrender your claims as an individual heir to the estate. It will not mention the separate corporate entity. Exactly. I confirmed a cold satisfaction settling over me. I will sign the document as Sloane the individual. The waiver will protect her inheritance of the bricks and the bank accounts, but it will offer absolutely zero legal protection against Apex Holdings, the corporation that owns the dirt she is standing on. She will believe she has neutralized me completely unaware that she just accepted a worthless piece of paper while leaving the nuclear warhead fully armed. Draft the document, Derek. I commanded, checking my watch. The deadline was rapidly approaching. I have to get to Oak Street. Julianne wants a performance of my submission. I am going to give her a show she will never forget. The taxi dropped me off on the corner of Oak Street at 2:45 in the afternoon. The commercial district was a testament to curated wealth lined with high-end designer storefronts, polished brass fixtures, and immaculate sidewalks. Julianne New Boutique occupied a prime corner parcel boasting massive floor-to-ceiling windows and an elegant, minimalist facade that screamed exclusivity. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, taking in the scene. I was wearing the same damp, borrowed gray suit from the morning. My hair was pulled back haphazardly, and my face bore the pale, exhausted pallor of someone who had spent the last 24 hours surviving an eviction and a corporate suspension. The contrast between my appearance and the opulent surroundings was stark and immediate. Through the expansive glass windows, I could see a private event underway. The boutique was filled with the city elite wealthy socialites, local influencers, and suited investors, clutching flutes of champagne. A string quartet played softly near a display of imported leather handbags. This was a soft launch, a networking event designed to secure the final financial commitments Julianne desperately needed to maintain her illusion of success. I pushed open the heavy glass door. The ambient hum of sophisticated conversation washed over me, accompanied by the clinking of crystal glasses. I did not make it past the entryway. 2 large security guards in dark suits stepped seamlessly into my path, crossing their arms and forming a solid physical barrier. They were the same 2 men who had dragged my mattress into the mud the night before. They recognized me instantly, their expressions hardening into masks of professional disdain. "This is a private event, miss." The larger guard stated, his voice a low rumble designed to intimidate. "You need to leave the premises immediately." I did not step back. I met his gaze, my posture rigid. "I am here to see Julianne. Tell her Sloane is here with the asset she requested." The guard scoffed, reaching out a heavy hand to shove my shoulder. I said, "Leave." Before his hand could make contact, a sharp, authoritative voice cut through the elegant murmur of the boutique. "Wait. Let her in." Julianne strode across the polished marble floor. She wore a stunning, backless emerald gown that clung perfectly to her figure. Her hair was styled in flawless waves, and a heavy diamond necklace glittered at her throat. She held a flute of champagne in one hand, radiating the absolute unearned confidence of a reigning monarch. The security guard stepped aside, allowing me to enter the main showroom. The conversations among the nearby guests faltered as they turned to assess the source of the commotion. They took in my rumpled, damp suit and my exhausted demeanor. Their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and polite revulsion. I was a glaring imperfection in their pristine environment. Julianne stopped a few feet in front of me, a vicious, triumphant smile spreading across her face. She looked me up and down, savoring the stark visual contrast between her opulence and my apparent destitution. She had orchestrated this moment perfectly. She had summoned me to her domain, surrounded by her wealthy peers, to witness my total capitulation. "Well, Sloane," Julianne announced, raising her voice slightly to ensure the surrounding investors could hear every word. "I must admit, I am surprised you showed up. I assumed you would be too busy packing your few remaining possessions into a cardboard box somewhere." A few soft, uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the nearest group of guests. They did not know the context, but they recognized the power dynamic. Julianne was the wealthy proprietor holding court. I was the pathetic interloper intruding upon her success. I did not react to the public insult. I kept my face utterly blank. "Where is Buster?" I demanded, keeping my voice low and direct. "I am here to collect him." Julianne took a slow, theatrical sip of her champagne. She lowered the glass, her smile sharpening into something infinitely more cruel. "Buster is currently secured in the loading dock area in the back. she replied, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. "The poor thing is barely mobile. He smells awful, and he was shedding all over the Italian marble I just had imported for the foyer. Frankly, sending him to the shelter is an act of mercy." She took a step closer, lowering her voice so only I could hear the extortion. "Did you bring the $10,000 in certified funds?" I maintained unbroken eye contact. "I do not have $10,000, Julianne." The triumphant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a flash of genuine panicked fury. Her eyes darted quickly toward a group of investors standing near the register. She needed that cash infusion immediately to appease the vendors demanding payment before the grand opening. "Then why are you here?" Julianne hissed, her voice venomous. "I told you the terms. If you do not have the money, the dog dies today. Get out of my store before I have security throw you onto the pavement." She turned on her heel, preparing to summon the guards. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer. "I did not bring cash," I stated, my voice ringing out clearly, halting her retreat. "But I brought something far more valuable to your long-term financial security." Julianne stopped and slowly turned back around. She eyed the thick folded document I withdrew from my pocket. Her suspicion battled visibly with her desperate greed. "What is that?" I unfolded the legal document Derek had drafted. I held it out so she could see the bold header printed across the top page. "It is a comprehensive family waiver and release of claims." I explained, speaking loudly enough for the nearest investors to overhear the legal terminology, lending an air of official corporate business to the exchange. "It is a legally binding notarized document stating that I, Sloane, formally surrender any and all rights to contest the inheritance of the primary estate, the liquid assets and all associated properties currently designated in our grandmother will." Julianne stared at the document, her eyes scanning the dense legal boilerplate. The realization of what I was offering hit her with the force of a physical blow. "You know as well as I do that my grandmother capacity was declining in her final months." I continued, adopting the tone of a defeated, pragmatic negotiator. "As her primary caretaker, I possess the standing to file a civil suit challenging the will based on undue influence. A lawsuit of that nature would freeze the probate process indefinitely. It would lock down the estate assets for years, preventing any immediate sale or liquidation of the property." I paused, letting the strategic threat settle over her. I knew the prospect of a frozen estate was her absolute worst nightmare. A delayed sale meant she would default on the $3 million fraudulent loan, leading to federal exposure and total ruin. "If I sign this waiver, I surrender that right permanently." I concluded, tapping the signature line at the bottom of the page. "You receive absolute, uncontested control of the inheritance immediately. No lawsuits, no delays, no legal challenges from me. Ever." Julianne swallowed hard. The raw, desperate hunger in her eyes was unmistakable. The waiver was a golden ticket, a guarantee that her fraudulent scheme to sell the estate to Titan Development would proceed without interference. It was worth infinitely more than a $10,000 cash infusion. But Julianne was a creature driven not just by greed, but by an insatiable need to inflict pain. Securing the waiver was not enough. She needed to break me completely in front of her audience. She needed to extract the maximum amount of humiliation to feed her fragile ego. She reached out and snatched the document from my hands. She read through the clauses quickly, her lips silently mouthing the legal jargon. When she reached the bottom page, a slow, sadistic grin spread across her face. "This is a generous offer, Sloane," Julianne said loudly, pivoting to address the entire room. "It seems my cousin finally recognizes her place. She is formally surrendering her ridiculous, unfounded claims to my grandmother wealth." She turned back to me, her eyes gleaming with malice. She held the document hostage, tapping it against her champagne flute. "I will accept this waiver in exchange for the animal. However, simply handing over a piece of paper lacks a certain sense of occasion." She reached into the pocket of her gown and pulled out a worn, faded leather dog collar. It belonged to Buster. The metal tags jingled faintly. She dropped the collar deliberately onto the polished marble floor between us. It landed with a sharp clatter that echoed through the quiet boutique. "Pick it up," Julianne commanded softly. I looked down at the collar resting on the cold stone. The humiliation was a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. I felt the eyes of every wealthy investor, every socialite, and every security guard burning into my skin. They were waiting to see if I would bow to her demand. "You want the dog," Julianne whispered, leaning in close. "You get down on your knees and you pick up the collar. Then you are going to take a tray from one of the catering staff, and you are going to walk through this room serving champagne to my guests for the next 30 minutes. You are going to serve the people who are funding my empire. If you refuse, I tear this waiver in half, I call the shelter, and you leave here with nothing." The cruelty was breathtaking in its precision. She was not just demanding compliance, she was demanding total subservience. She wanted the wealthy elite of Chicago to view me as her personal servant, a destitute relative begging for a handout. She wanted to annihilate my dignity before she granted my request. The silence in the boutique was absolute. The string quartet had stopped playing. The guests watched with morbid fascination spectators at a modern gladiator match where the violence was entirely psychological. I stared at Julianne, absorbing the sheer venomous depth of her hatred. I felt the heat of fury rising in my chest, a primal urge to scream, to strike her, to tear down the facade she had built on the bones of a fraudulent loan. But I did not react. I did not allow a single flicker of anger to cross my face. I remembered the heavy ivory envelope secured in my jacket pocket. I remembered the forensic accounting spread across Derek's kitchen table. I remembered the undeniable power of the ground lease. Julianne believed she was orchestrating my ultimate defeat. She had no idea that I was simply allowing her to climb higher up the gallows before I pulled the lever. I kept my eyes locked on hers. I slowly bent my knees, lowering myself onto the cold marble floor in front of her. The rough fabric of my borrowed suit scraped against the stone. I reached out with a steady hand and picked up Buster's worn leather collar. I stood back up, clutching the collar tightly in my fist. I turned toward a nearby catering waiter, took a silver tray loaded with crystal flutes of champagne, and began walking through the crowd of silent, staring guests. I served them their drinks, my face a mask of impenetrable calm, while Julianne watched me with a triumphant, sickening smile. The humiliation was intense, but it was entirely superficial. I was serving her guests today, knowing with absolute certainty that by tomorrow night I would own the ground they were standing on. The 30 minutes I spent circulating the boutique with the silver tray felt like an eternity suspended in amber. I moved systematically through the clusters of wealthy investors and local socialites, offering crystal flutes of champagne with a steady, practiced neutrality. I did not make eye contact. I did not flinch when they murmured quietly behind their hands as I passed. I functioned as an invisible extension of the catering staff, a living prop in Julianne's elaborate theater of humiliation. I watched her from across the room. She held court near a display of imported leather goods, her emerald gown catching the light as she laughed brightly at a joke told by a prominent venture capitalist. She kept casting triumphant glances in my direction, ensuring that everyone in her orbit noticed her destitute cousin serving the drinks. She believed she had executed a masterclass in psychological dominance. She believed she had broken me. When the agonizing half-hour finally concluded, I returned the empty silver tray to the catering station. My hands were perfectly steady. The humiliation had not penetrated my core. It had merely hardened into a cold, tactical armor. I walked directly toward the rear of the boutique, pushing past the heavy velvet curtains that separated the showroom from the employee-restricted areas. I found Buster in a small, windowless loading dock adjacent to the alleyway access doors. The space smelled of cardboard and damp concrete. He was lying on the cold floor, his head resting heavily on his front paws, looking incredibly frail and confused. The moment he heard my footsteps, his tail gave a weak, rhythmic thump against the concrete. He struggled to stand, his arthritic hips failing him on the slick surface. I rushed forward, dropping to my knees and wrapping my arms tightly around his neck. The familiar scent of his fur, dusty and slightly stale, hit me instantly, bringing a sharp sting of tears to my eyes. I buried my face in his neck, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. I had him. I had secured the only piece of my grandmother legacy that actually possessed a heartbeat. Well, isn't that a touching reunion? The cold voice sliced through the damp air of the loading dock. I looked up to see Julianne standing in the doorway, the velvet curtain draped elegantly over one arm. She held the family waiver and release of claims document I had brought her along with a sleek silver pen. She stepped fully into the harsh fluorescent light of the dock, her expression devoid of the performative charm she utilized in the showroom. The mask was off, revealing the raw, unadulterated malice beneath. Sign the waiver, Sloane. Julianne demanded, stepping forward and extending the document and the pen toward me. "You served your penance for the investors. Now give me the legal immunity, and you can take this useless animal and get out of my sight." I stood up slowly, keeping one hand resting protectively on Busterhead. I took the document and the pen from her hands. I did not rush. I took a moment to review the text one final time, confirming that Derek precise legal drafting remained unaltered. The document was dense with aggressive legal boilerplate. It explicitly stated that I, Sloane, as an individual heir, formally and permanently waived any right to contest the last will and testament of my grandmother. It relinquished all personal claims to the primary estate, the physical mansion, the liquid assets, the vehicles, and any personal property therein. It was a comprehensive surrender of my individual inheritance rights. But as Derek had brilliantly engineered, the document contained a glaring intentional omission. The waiver did not include a single mention of corporate entities, shell companies, or subsidiary holdings. It did not contain the crucial legal phrasing required to waive claims on behalf of a corporation I might represent or control. Most importantly, the words Apex Holdings did not appear anywhere on the paper. Julianne, blinded by her arrogance and her desperate need to secure the physical estate for the Titan development sale, read the document exactly as she wanted to read it. She saw a blanket surrender from a defeated cousin. She lacked the forensic financial literacy to recognize the gaping loophole. She did not know that Apex Holdings existed, and therefore she did not know she needed to demand immunity from it. "I am signing this under duress to secure the release of my dog," I stated, maintaining the facade of a cornered, desperate victim. "You know this will not hold up in court if I challenge the circumstances of the signing." Julianne let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Oh, please, Sloane, spare me the amateur legal threats. You do not have the money to hire a lawyer to challenge a parking ticket, let alone a notarized waiver. You are broke. You are suspended from your job. You are entirely irrelevant. Sign the paper." I placed the document against the concrete wall of the loading dock. I unclipped the cap of the silver pen. I did not hesitate. I did not allow my hand to tremble. I signed my name Sloane with a bold, fluid stroke at the bottom of the page. I turned and handed the signed waiver back to her. Julianne snatched the document from my hand, inspecting the signature with a look of profound, victorious satisfaction. She folded the heavy paper carefully and slipped it into the pocket of her gown. She looked down at me, her eyes glittering with absolute contempt. "You have always been weak, Sloane," Julianne sneered, stepping closer. "You spent 5 years changing bedpans and playing nursemaid because you thought it would earn you a piece of the empire. You thought your pathetic loyalty would be rewarded. But the world does not reward the weak. It rewards those who take what they want. You are leaving here with a dying dog and the clothes on your back. I am leaving here with millions." She gestured toward the heavy metal door leading to the back alley. "Take your trash and get off my property. If I ever see your face near my estate again, I will have you arrested for trespassing." I did not offer a rebuttal. I did not defend my loyalty to my grandmother or point out the profound emptiness of her stolen empire. Engaging with a narcissist only validates their delusion of power. I knelt down and gently fastened the worn leather collar around Buster's neck. I helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as he steadied himself on his arthritic legs. I guided him slowly toward the heavy metal exit door. I pushed the crash bar, swinging the door open to the cold, bustling Chicago alleyway. I paused in the threshold, looking back at Julianne one final time. She stood under the harsh fluorescent lights of the loading dock, clutching the signed waiver like a trophy, utterly convinced she had executed the perfect checkmate. "Enjoy your evening, Julianne," I said quietly, my voice barely carrying over the ambient noise of the city. I stepped out into the alley, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind me with a definitive ringing clang. I walked Buster slowly down the alleyway, the cold wind biting through my damp suit. I did not feel defeated. I did not feel the crushing weight of the humiliation I had just endured. I felt an exhilarating, razor-sharp clarity. Julianne believed she had stripped me of my weapons. She thought the waiver neutralized any threat I posed to her fraudulent $3 million loan and the impending sale of the estate to Titan Development. She thought she owned the ground she was standing on. She had just accepted a worthless piece of paper. I had surrendered my personal claims to the bricks and the bank account's assets that were already hopelessly entangled in her mortgage fraud. I had given her the illusion of total victory, ensuring she would proceed with the Titan development Gala without a single hesitation. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed Derek's number. He answered on the first ring. "I have Buster," I said, reaching down to stroke the soft fur behind the dog ears. And she accepted the waiver exactly as we drafted it. She did not question the corporate omissions. Derek let out a low, satisfied exhale on the other end of the line. "Excellent." She thinks she closed the door, but she left the entire foundation exposed. "I have been monitoring the Titan development communications. The Gala is confirmed for tomorrow night at the main estate. The CEO of Titan is flying in personally to sign the $5 million purchase agreement." I stopped walking, looking out toward the busy street at the end of the alley. "She is moving fast," I noted. "The private equity loan must be closer to default than we anticipated. She needs that $5 million immediately to cover the fraudulent mortgage before they audit the paperwork." "Exactly," Derek confirmed. "Tomorrow night is the flashpoint. If she signs that contract, she secures the funds to bury the forgery. We cannot wait for the probate courts. We have to detonate the ground lease before pen hits paper." I looked down at the heavy ivory envelope still resting safely in my inner jacket pocket. The wax seal was broken, but the power it contained was fully primed. My grandmother had not just left me a hidden asset, she had left me a detonator. "Print the formal eviction notices for Apex Holdings, Derek." I instructed, my voice hard and uncompromising. "Draft the cease and desist orders for the Titan development contract. Prepare the entire corporate portfolio." "Understood." Derek replied, his tone shifting into absolute professional focus. "What is the execution strategy?" "Julianne wanted to humiliate me in front of her investors today," I said, a cold, dangerous smile finally touching my lips. "Tomorrow night we return the favor. We are going to walk into her Gala, and we are going to repossess the ground beneath her feet in front of the entire city." The 24 hours following the incident at the boutique moved with the frantic, compressed energy of a countdown clock. I did not return to the corporate office. The suspension was a tactical distraction I no longer had the bandwidth to entertain. My focus and Derek's complete forensic arsenal were locked entirely on the impending Gala at the main estate. We transformed Natalie's dining room table into a war room. Stacks of printed financial ledgers, corporate registry printouts, and architectural blueprints covered every inch of the mahogany surface. Buster slept soundly on a thick orthopedic dog bed in the corner, exhausted from the ordeal, but safe. His steady breathing was the only calming element in the room. Derek sat at the head of the table, his 3 monitors glowing with encrypted data feeds. He had spent the night dissecting the structure of the Titan development acquisition. The deeper he dug, the more precarious Julianne's position appeared. "This is a distress sale of the highest magnitude," Derek announced, tapping his stylus against the screen. "The private equity firm holding the $3 million fraudulent loan issued a final notice of default yesterday afternoon. They are moving to seize the collateral, the main estate, by the end of the week. Julianne is entirely out of time." He pulled up a digital copy of the proposed purchase agreement between Julianne and Titan Development. The numbers were stark and unforgiving. Titan Development is fully aware she is desperate. Derek continued, highlighting a specific clause. "They are offering $5 million for the estate, which is easily $2 million under market value for that acreage. But they are demanding an immediate, expedited closing. If the contract is signed tonight, the funds hit an escrow account by tomorrow morning, allowing Julianne to satisfy the private equity loan and sweep the forged mortgage documents under the rug before the lenders can audit them." I leaned over his shoulder, reading the fine print of the Titan agreement. What are they planning to do with the property? Derek switched the monitor display to a series of architectural renderings he had pulled from municipal zoning filings. It is a total demolition. Titan Development specializes in high-density luxury condominiums. They plan to raze the main estate and the guest house to the ground by the end of the month. They are buying the location, not the architecture. The image of the bulldozers tearing through the gardens where my grandmother used to sit, ripping down the walls of the home that had been in our family for decades, sent a sharp, visceral spike of anger through my chest. Julianne was not just selling an asset. She was erasing our history to cover her own criminal tracks. She cannot legally execute this sale, I stated, pointing to the property description in the contract. She does not own the ground lease. Titan legal team will require clear title to the land before they release $5 million. How does she plan to bypass their due diligence? Derek offered a grim, cynical smile. Arrogance and momentum. Julianne is relying on the illusion of her inherited wealth. The Titan CEO is flying in personally tonight to sign the agreement because he believes he is securing a massive discount. Julianne lawyers likely provided a preliminary title report that only reflects the ownership of the physical structures. In expedited distress sales buyers sometimes delay the final deep-dive title search until the escrow period begins. Julianne is gambling that by the time Titan discovers the ground lease belongs to Apex Holdings, she will already have the cash required to pay off the fraudulent loan and avoid federal prison. She plans to fight the land dispute in civil court later, using Titan money to fund her defense. It was a breathtakingly audacious strategy, reliant entirely on speed and the distraction of the Gala. She had orchestrated the massive, opulent event tonight, not merely as a celebration, but as a smokescreen. She wanted to blind the Titan executives with champagne high society networking and the sheer spectacle of her supposed wealth, rushing them to the signing table before they looked too closely at the paperwork. "We cannot wait for the probate courts or file an injunction on Monday." I said, the reality of the timeline solidifying in my mind. If pen hits paper tonight, the escrow process initiates. Even if the sale eventually falls apart over the ground lease, the legal entanglement will take years to untangle. We have to stop the signing before it happens. We have to detonate the bomb in the middle of... Derek agreed, his eyes locking onto mine with a shared, intense resolve. We need to introduce the Apex Holdings ground lease directly into the negotiation publicly, where Julianne cannot control the narrative or hide the documentation from the Titan CEO. I looked at the heavy ivory envelope resting near my laptop, the wax seal broken, the power within it fully accessible. Natalie walked into the dining room carrying 2 heavy garment bags. She had spent the afternoon retrieving our formal wear from the dry cleaners. "If we are crashing a high society gala," she said, her voice steady and determined, "we need to look like we belong in the room. We cannot walk in looking like desperate interlopers. We need to look like the executioners." The strategy was set. We were not going to skulk around the perimeter or beg for an audience. We were going to walk through the front doors of the estate, armed with irrefutable corporate documentation, and we were going to repossess the ground beneath their feet in front of the entire city elite. By 7 o'clock that evening, the transformation was complete. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in Natalie hallway. I was not the exhausted, damp woman who had been dragged out of the guest house in the mud. I wore a tailored floor-length midnight blue gown that struck the perfect balance between aggressive elegance and corporate formality. My hair was styled sharply away from my face. My posture was rigid and uncompromising. Derek emerged from the guest room wearing a pristine custom black tuxedo. He carried a sleek black leather portfolio case. Inside the case rested the certified notarized copies of the Apex Holdings corporate registry, the original ground lease deed, and the formal notices of eviction. The forensic evidence was organized with lethal precision. "You ready to reclaim your empire?" Derek asked, adjusting his cuffs with the calm efficiency of a soldier preparing for a tactical breach. I picked up my evening clutch, ensuring the small encrypted flash drive containing the digital copies of the deeds was secure inside. "I am ready to end hers," I replied. We drove the familiar route toward the affluent hills of Connecticut. The weather had cleared, leaving the autumn night crisp and sharp. The closer we drew to the estate, the more evident the scale of Julianne orchestration became. A line of luxury vehicles and black town cars stretched down the winding country road, waiting to pass through the towering wrought iron gates. The gates themselves were flanked by private security guards, checking names against illuminated tablets. This was not an open invitation event. It was a highly vetted, exclusive gathering of potential investors, local politicians, and the upper echelon of the commercial real estate sector. Derek steered his heavy SUV into the line of waiting cars. "How are we getting past the gate?" he asked quietly, his hands relaxed on the steering wheel. "We are definitely not on the guest list, and those guards are going to recognize you from the eviction." I looked at the security checkpoint looming ahead. "They will recognize me," I confirmed, "but they will not stop me." We pulled up to the guard station. A burly man in a dark suit stepped up to the driver's side window, shining a small tactical flashlight toward the interior. I recognized him immediately. He was the guard who had forcefully twisted my arm and seized my car keys in the rain. He leaned down, squinting into the SUV. "Name for the guest list." He grunted, his tone bored and dismissive. I leaned forward from the passenger seat, moving my face directly into the beam of his flashlight. He recognized me instantly. The boredom vanished, replaced by a flash of surprise and immediate hostility. His hand instinctively reached toward the radio clipped to his shoulder. "You are not permitted on this property," the guard barked, his voice rising in volume. "Miss Julianne gave explicit orders that you are banned from the premises. Turn the vehicle around right now, or I am calling for backup to forcefully remove you." I did not flinch. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a single sheet of heavy legal paper. It was not an invitation. It was a formal, notarized cease and desist order drafted by Derek, asserting my legal right to access the property as the controlling executive of Apex Holdings, the entity that owned the ground lease. I pressed the document flat against the glass of the passenger window directly in front of the guard face. "Read the header." I commanded, my voice slicing through the cold night air with absolute authority. "This is a formal legal notice asserting my right of entry as the landowner. If you attempt to restrict my access to my own property, or if you lay a hand on me or my vehicle, I will not call the local police. I will have the federal authorities arrest you for unlawful detainment and interference with a commercial property right." The guard hesitated, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon and the prominent notary seals. He was a private security contractor hired to intimidate unwanted guests, not a legal scholar equipped to debate complex property law. The sheer confidence in my voice, combined with the intimidating presence of Derek in a tuxedo and the highly official-looking document, short-circuited his protocol. He understood violence and volume. He did not understand corporate compliance. He looked back at the long line of expensive cars waiting behind us, the wealthy guests growing impatient. He did not want to cause a massive scene at the front gate that would draw the attention of the Titan development executives currently arriving. "I am radioing the main house," the guard muttered, stepping back slightly, his bravado faltering. "Radio whoever you want," I replied coldly. "But open the gate, now." The guard weighed his options for 3 agonizing seconds. The threat of federal involvement, however abstract, outweighed his loyalty to Julianne. He pressed a button on his remote. The heavy wrought iron gates swung slowly open, granting us passage into the belly of the beast. Derek accelerated smoothly up the long gravel driveway. The main estate loomed ahead, brilliantly illuminated by dozens of strategic spotlights. The sprawling lawns were dotted with heated white tents and elegant cocktail stations. A string quartet played on the sweeping front terrace. Valets rushed to open the doors of arriving luxury vehicles. It was a breathtaking display of stolen wealth. Julianne had spared no expense to project an image of untouchable success. She was spending money she did not have secured by a loan she acquired through forgery to impress a buyer she intended to defraud. It was a house of cards reaching toward the sky, and we had arrived with the hurricane. Derek parked the SUV near the edge of the valet circle, refusing to hand the keys to the attendants. We stepped out of the vehicle, the crisp air carrying the scent of expensive perfume and catered appetizers. We walked up the wide stone steps toward the massive double doors of the main entrance. No one stopped us. We blended seamlessly into the current of arriving high society guests. We stepped over the threshold and into the grand marble-floored foyer of the estate. The interior was magnificent, a testament to my grandmother, impeccable taste now hijacked for Julianne, desperate charade. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, glittering light over hundreds of guests, mingling in the expansive living areas. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. I scanned the room, tuning out the ambient noise of the party. I was not here to mingle. I was here to locate the target. I found her at the far end of the grand ballroom, standing on a slightly elevated dais near the massive stone fireplace. Julianne wore a stunning, backless crimson gown that commanded the attention of the room. She was holding a microphone, laughing brightly at a comment made by the man standing beside her. The man was older, silver-haired, projecting the unmistakable aura of ruthless corporate power. He wore a perfectly tailored dark suit and held a crystal tumbler of scotch. I recognized him immediately from the dossiers Derek had compiled. It was Richard Vance, the chief executive officer of Titan Development, the man holding the $5 million check. And resting on a small ornate wooden table situated directly between them was a thick leather-bound portfolio. The purchase agreement, the execution document. The timeline had compressed from hours to mere minutes. Julianne was preparing to address the crowd and sign the contract publicly, turning the sale into a grand spectacle of her business acumen. She was moving to finalize the transaction right now. Derek caught my eye, gripping the handle of his leather portfolio case. "It is time," he said quietly. I nodded. I squared my shoulders, lifting my chin, and began the long walk across the crowded ballroom. The moment for quiet compliance was over. The public execution was about to begin. The grand ballroom of the estate was a sea of glittering jewels-tailored suits and the low, sophisticated hum of high-stakes networking. I moved through the crowd with Derek matching my pace, our trajectory, a straight, unyielding line toward the elevated dais at the far end of the room. The air was thick with the scent of expensive floral arrangements and the sharp metallic tang of my own adrenaline. We were not invited guests. We were an incoming disruption, and as we closed the distance, the ambient chatter began to falter around us. People instinctively stepped aside, sensing the sudden focused tension radiating from our approach. Julianne stood on the dais, bathed in the warm glow of the overhead spotlights. She held a sleek silver fountain pen poised elegantly above the thick leather portfolio resting on the ornate table. Richard Vance, the imposing CEO of Titan Development, stood beside her, a look of satisfied anticipation settling over his features. He believed he was moments away from securing a multi-million-dollar property at a significant discount. He had no idea the ground beneath him was rigged to explode. I stopped 10 feet from the base of the dais. I did not shout. I did not wave my arms. I simply stood still, my posture rigid, my eyes locked onto Julianne. The silence rippled outward from my position, pulling the attention of the surrounding guests. The string quartet positioned on a nearby balcony faltered and ceased playing as the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. Julianne caught the movement in her peripheral vision. She turned her head, her triumphant smile freezing instantly as her eyes landed on me. The color drained from her face for a fraction of a second, her brain struggling to process the impossible sight. She had orchestrated my eviction into a storm. She had stripped me of my car and my income. She had extorted a signed waiver from me just yesterday, confident she had entirely neutralized my existence. Yet here I stood, draped in midnight blue silk, flanked by a formidable man holding a leather briefcase, looking nothing like a defeated victim. But Julianne was a creature of malignant narcissism. Panic rapidly curdled into a furious defensive arrogance. She refused to acknowledge the possibility that I possessed any actual leverage. In her mind, my presence was merely a desperate, pathetic attempt to disrupt her moment of glory. She decided to use my arrival not as a warning sign, but as a final spectacular opportunity to publicly annihilate me. She gripped the microphone tightly in her hand and stepped to the edge of the dais, looking down at me with an expression of profound theatrical pity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julianne announced, her voice echoing sharply through the high-quality sound system, demanding the attention of every person in the ballroom. The hundreds of guests turned toward the dais, their conversations dying away completely. "I must apologize for this unfortunate interruption." Julianne continued, her tone dripping with manufactured sorrow. "It seems a deeply troubled individual has managed to slip past our security perimeter." She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, ensuring every eye in the room followed her gesture. "This woman standing before you is my cousin Sloane," Julianne proclaimed, her voice projecting clearly over the silent crowd. "For the past 5 years, my family generously allowed her to live in the guest house on this property. We trusted her to assist with the care of my late grandmother. We opened our home to her." She paused, letting the dramatic weight of her words settle over the audience. Richard Vance frowned slightly, looking between Julianne and me, clearly displeased by the sudden dramatic turn of events during his contract signing. Tragically, Sloane repaid our kindness with profound deceit. Julianne stated, her voice hardening with righteous indignation. Following my grandmother passing an internal audit revealed that Sloane had been systematically siphoning funds from the estate accounts. She exploited a dying woman, stealing money and priceless family heirlooms to fund her own pathetic lifestyle. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. The wealthy socialites and corporate investors stared at me, their faces contorting with visible disgust and revulsion. Julianne was painting me as a predator, a despicable thief who preyed upon the elderly. She was executing a flawless character assassination in front of the very people who controlled the social and financial currents of the city. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with her. The humiliation she sought to inflict felt entirely distant, as if I were watching a poorly acted play from behind a thick pane of glass. I knew the truth resting in Derek's briefcase. I knew the crushing reality she was about to face. Her words were nothing more than the desperate flailing of a drowning woman. But Julianne was not finished. She wanted absolute destruction. She signaled toward a technician stationed near the audiovisual controls at the side of the room. When confronted with her crimes, Sloane became violent and erratic. Julianne declared, her voice rising in pitch to ensure maximum dramatic effect. For the safety of my family and this estate, I had no choice but to forcefully evict her from the premises. The massive digital screens flanking the main fireplace, which had previously displayed elegant logos of her luxury boutique, suddenly flashed and changed images. A collective murmur of shock rippled through the crowd. Projected on the massive screens larger than life, and in high definition, was a photograph taken 2 nights ago. It showed me kneeling in the mud, my hair plastered to my face by the freezing rain, desperately clutching my wet canvas duffel bag. My belongings were scattered violently across the wet grass behind me. I looked broken, pathetic, and utterly defeated. Julianne had instructed her security guards to photograph the eviction. She had saved the image, planning to use it as a twisted trophy, a visual testament to her absolute dominance. Now she was broadcasting my lowest, most vulnerable moment to hundreds of strangers to solidify my humiliation. This is what happens to parasites who attempt to steal from this family, Julianne stated coldly, her voice echoing over the stunned silence of the ballroom. She is a mentally unstable, vindictive thief who refuses to accept reality. She came here tonight to cause a scene because she cannot fathom that she has lost everything. The cruelty was suffocating. She had weaponized my eviction, my poverty, and my fabricated crimes using a giant screen to strip away any remaining shred of my dignity. The audience stared at the image of me in the mud and then looked back at me standing in the ballroom, their judgment swift and brutal. Julianne turned her attention away from the crowd and signaled the security team stationed near the main entrance. "Guards, remove this woman from my property immediately," Julianne commanded sharply. "Drag her out to the street where she belongs. I will not allow a deranged thief to disrupt the signing of this historic contract." 4 large private security guards began moving purposefully through the crowd, their eyes locked on to me and Derek. They were approaching rapidly, their postures aggressive and uncompromising. They intended to physically seize me and throw me out of the doors, completing the public execution Julianne had orchestrated. I felt the sudden, intense surge of adrenaline, the primal instinct to fight or flee, as the guards closed the distance. The entire ballroom held its breath, waiting for the physical confrontation to begin. Julianne stood on the dais, a triumphant, malicious smile spreading across her face as she turned back to the Titan Development CEO, gesturing toward the purchase agreement. She believed she had won. She believed she had silenced the threat and secured the $5 million lifeline she desperately needed to cover her fraudulent loan. She had no idea that her grand theatrical performance was the exact catalyst we needed. As the security guards reached out their heavy hands to grab my arms, I did not scream. I did not struggle. I simply turned my head slightly, catching Derek's eye, and delivered a single sharp nod. The time for absorbing her abuse was over. The counterstrike was officially authorized. The heavy hand of the lead security guard clamped down onto my shoulder. His fingers dug painfully into the silk fabric of my gown, a physical confirmation that Julianne intended to forcefully eject me from the ballroom. The 3 other guards moved in seamlessly to flank Derek, aiming to neutralize any resistance. The wealthy guests surrounding us instinctively recoiled, creating a tight, tense circle of clear space for the impending physical removal. Julianne stood on the elevated dais, watching the guards execute her order. A look of supreme malicious satisfaction settled over her features. She turned her attention back to the imposing CEO of Titan Development, lifting the silver fountain pen, ready to sign the $5 million lifeline that would validate her fraudulent empire. I did not attempt to break the guard grip. I did not raise my voice in a desperate plea for justice. The time for engaging with her fabricated narrative had passed. I simply turned my head slightly, catching Derek's eye, and delivered a single sharp nod. Derek did not hesitate. He did not attempt to fight the guards closing in around him. He simply dropped his hand to the sleek tablet resting inside his open leather portfolio case. His fingers tapped a rapid sequence across the glass screen. Derek was a forensic accountant, but he spent his career analyzing the digital infrastructure of modern corporate environments. He understood that high-end residential estates operated on integrated smart systems. Hours before we arrived, he had run a targeted trace on the estate network, locating the insecure outward-facing portal, controlling the audiovisual system. He had not hacked the mainframe to steal data. He had simply hijacked the display outputs. The execution was instantaneous. The massive digital screens flanking the stone fireplace, which had been broadcasting the humiliating image of me, shivering in the mud, suddenly went entirely black. The sudden absence of the bright photograph startled the audience. The low murmur of the crowd halted as hundreds of eyes darted toward the sudden darkness on the walls. For 2 agonizing seconds, the ballroom was plunged into a confused silence. Julianne paused the silver pen hovering inches above the leather-bound purchase agreement. She frowned, casting an irritated glance toward the audiovisual technician stationed near the wall, assuming a simple equipment malfunction had interrupted her moment of triumph. Then the screens flared back to life with a violent, blinding intensity. They did not display a corporate logo or a scenic photograph. The dual screens projected a solid, aggressive crimson red. The color washed over the opulent ballroom, casting a harsh emergency glare across the crystal chandeliers and the faces of the startled guests. The red light reflected sharply off the polished marble floors, instantly transforming the elegant Gala into the visual equivalent of a severe hazard warning. A stark, brutal block of white text snapped into the center of the crimson displays. The font was massive, rigid, and entirely devoid of any aesthetic warmth. The words pulsed rhythmically on the screens, demanding the absolute attention of every person in the room. Warning ground. Lease violation detected. Property of Apex Holdings. Immediate cease and desist order active. The collective gasp that swept through the ballroom was visceral. It was not a sound of polite surprise. It was the sharp intake of breath from hundreds of high-level corporate executives and investors who instantly recognized the terrifying legal implications of the words projected before them. A ground lease violation during a commercial property signing was not a minor administrative error. It was a catastrophic failure of title. The security guard gripping my shoulder stiffened in confusion, his eyes fixed on the blazing red screens. His grip loosened marginally as his brain struggled to process the sudden aggressive shift in the environment. He was hired to handle unruly guests, not to navigate a sudden digital corporate takeover. Derek reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved a small wireless microphone. He had anticipated the need to cut through the ambient noise of the crowd. He activated the device and pressed it firmly into my hand. Julianne stood frozen on the dais. The confident, malicious smirk had vanished, entirely replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. The red light washed over her emerald gown, highlighting the sudden, frantic darting of her eyes as she stared at the warnings pulsing on the walls. She looked down at the purchase agreement, then back at the screens, her mind frantically trying to connect the dots she had fundamentally failed to observe. I raised the microphone to my lips. My voice, amplified by the high-quality sound system, boomed across the silent ballroom, crisp, resonant, and dripping with absolute, undeniable authority. It sliced cleanly through the lingering shock of the crowd, commanding the space completely. I did not forge those documents, Julianne. I stated my tone devoid of any emotion, addressing her directly across the vast expanse of the room. And I did not steal a single dime from my grandmother accounts. But I did discover the one asset you were too arrogant to realize you never owned. The wealthy guests watched me in stunned fascination. The narrative Julianne had so carefully constructed only moments ago was disintegrating in real time. I was no longer the pathetic, deranged thief she had projected on the screen. I was the architect of a sudden, brutal corporate ambush, and I possessed the documentation to prove it. You own the bricks of this house, Julianne. I continued, my voice steady and relentless, echoing off the high ceilings. You inherited the drywall, the crystal chandeliers, and the Italian marble foyer. but the physical structures sit on top of a commercial ground lease that was quietly severed from the primary estate 10 years ago by a woman who anticipated your exact level of greed. Julianne's mouth opened and closed silently, her face draining of color. The silver fountain pen slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered onto the table, rolling off the edge and landing on the floor near the feet of the Titan Development CEO. Apex Holdings owns the dirt beneath your feet, I declared, lifting my chin, feeling the profound, exhilarating weight of absolute leverage. And as the sole executive controller of Apex Holdings, I am formally informing you that the ground lease for this parcel officially expired at midnight last night. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. The ambient noise of the party had ceased entirely. No one shifted in their seats. No one whispered to their neighbor. The entire ballroom was paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the legal bomb I had just detonated. "You are currently standing on my property, Julianne," I stated, delivering the final crushing blow. "You are an unauthorized tenant attempting to sell a $5 million structure on land you have zero legal right to occupy. Any contract you sign tonight is entirely void, and any attempt to transfer this property will be met with immediate federal litigation for title fraud." I lowered the microphone. The red screens continued to pulse their dire warnings against the walls. Julianne stood on the elevated dais, bathed in the crimson light, entirely exposed before the most powerful investors in the city. The elaborate multi-million-dollar illusion she had constructed to save herself from federal prison had just been publicly, undeniably shattered by the very cousin she had thrown into the mud 24 hours prior. The trap had sprung, completely reversing the power dynamic. She had tried to humiliate me, but I had just ensured that she would be leaving the ballroom with absolutely nothing. The room waited, suffocating under the heavy, expectant tension, to see how the powerful CEO standing beside her would react to the revelation that he was moments away from buying a worthless pile of bricks. The pulsating red glare from the massive screens bathed the dais in an alarming, urgent light. Julianne's face, moments ago, flushed with the thrill of impending victory, was now a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. Her skin had taken on a sickly, translucent pallor stark against the emerald green of her designer gown. She stared at the bold white text, demanding an immediate cease and desist, her mind frantically trying to process the catastrophic failure of her grand design. "This is a lie," Julianne stammered, her voice shrill and entirely devoid of its previous aristocratic confidence. Her gaze darted wildly around the silent, staring ballroom, desperately seeking an ally among the wealthy elite she had tried so hard to impress. "She is making this up. It is a fabricated stunt. The estate belongs entirely to me. My legal team cleared the title for the transfer." She turned her desperate, pleading eyes toward Richard Vance, the imposing CEO of Titan Development, who was standing beside her. She reached out, placing a trembling hand on his tailored sleeve. "Mr. Vance, please do not listen to her," Julianne pleaded, her voice dropping into a frantic whisper that the microphone on the table easily picked up and broadcast to the room. "She is a bitter, unemployed relative. We can proceed with the signing. The property is mine to sell. I guarantee it." Richard Vance did not look at the trembling woman grasping his arm. He did not look at the leather-bound purchase agreement resting on the ornate table. The veteran real estate tycoon, a man who had built a billion-dollar empire navigating the treacherous waters of commercial acquisitions, possessed an instinct for disaster that superseded any verbal assurance. He slowly, deliberately pulled his arm away from Julianne's grasp. The gesture was small, but it carried the devastating weight of total professional rejection. He turned his body fully toward her. His piercing, assessing eyes locked onto her face with the cold, unforgiving intensity of a predator, determining that the prey was tainted. He was not a man swayed by emotional pleas or theatrical denials. He operated entirely on the ruthless logic of liability and risk assessment. "Miss Sinclair," Vance began, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that silenced whatever remaining whispers lingered in the ballroom. The tone was devoid of any social pleasantries. It was the voice of a man who realized someone was attempting to sell him a sinking ship. "Are you standing before me in front of my investors and my legal representatives, stating that you initiated a $5 million commercial real estate transaction without definitively securing the rights to the ground lease?" He demanded spacing each word carefully to emphasize the sheer spectacular incompetence of the scenario. Julianne swallowed hard, a visible bead of sweat tracking through the heavy makeup on her temple. No, absolutely not. The estate was willed to me entirely. My lawyers ran the deed. A preliminary title report on the structural assets is fundamentally worthless if the land beneath it is controlled by a hostile third-party corporation. Vance interrupted his voice, sharpening into a lethal edge. Titan Development does not purchase buildings. We purchase land. If you do not possess the clear, unencumbered rights to the dirt under this estate, you possess absolutely nothing of value to my firm. He stepped closer to her, his physical presence dominating the small space on the dais. Answer the question directly. Do you or do you not possess the legally recorded ground lease for this parcel? Julianne was drowning the panic, completely overriding whatever fragile composure she had left. She scrambled for the only lifeline she believed she possessed, entirely unaware that the rope had been severed the moment she accepted it. "I have a waiver!" Julianne cried out, reaching frantically into the bodice of her gown. Her hands shook violently as she withdrew a folded piece of heavy paper. She thrust it toward the CEO like a shield. "She signed it yesterday. Sloane signed a comprehensive family waiver and release of claims. She surrendered all rights to contest my inheritance of the estate. She formally abandoned any claim to the property. This document proves she has no legal standing to interfere with the sale tonight." She held the waiver out, her eyes wide and pleading desperately, hoping the piece of paper would validate her authority and salvage the collapsing deal. She believed the waiver neutralized any threat I posed. She believed she had outsmarted me. Richard Vance did not take the paper from her shaking hand. He merely leaned forward, adjusting his reading glasses to scrutinize the document she held up to the light. He was a man who spent his days dissecting complex corporate contracts. He did not need a team of lawyers to identify a catastrophic legal omission. He only needed 3 seconds. He read the bold headers, skimmed the personal release clauses, and scanned the signature block at the bottom of the page. He let out a slow, heavy breath, an exhalation that conveyed profound, unmitigated disgust. He slowly removed his reading glasses, folding them deliberately, before placing them into his breast pocket. He looked at Julianne with an expression of pure, unfiltered contempt. It was the look reserved for amateurs who attempted to play in a league they could not comprehend. "This document is a personal waiver of individual inheritance claims." Vance stated, his voice ringing out across the silent ballroom, delivering the final fatal blow to her illusion. "It explicitly waives the rights of Sloane, as an individual heir, to contest the distribution of your late grandmother's personal estate." He pointed a rigid finger at the paper trembling in Julianne's hand. "It contains absolutely zero mention of corporate entities, subsidiary holdings, or holding companies." Vance continued, his tone cold and decisive. "It does not contain a single clause waiving the rights of Apex Holdings. If the ground lease is registered to that specific corporate entity, this piece of paper is entirely worthless against their claim. You secured a personal surrender, but you left the corporate liability fully armed." Julianne's mouth fell open. Her eyes dropped to the waiver in her hand, staring at the dense legal text, as if the words themselves had suddenly turned into venomous snakes. The realization hit her with the crushing force of a physical impact. She had been so blinded by her desire to humiliate me, so focused on extracting a personal defeat, that she had completely failed to read the document with any strategic comprehension. She had accepted the Trojan horse without ever checking inside. You attempted to leverage a $5 million corporate acquisition based on a fundamental misunderstanding of property law. Vance declared, his voice rising, carrying the full weight of his anger. You neglected the most basic tenets of commercial due diligence, and you brought Titan Development into this room to serve as the unwitting financier for your gross negligence. He turned away from her, a gesture of absolute dismissal. He reached down to the ornate wooden table and picked up the thick, leather-bound portfolio containing the purchase agreement. Titan Development does not do business with individuals who conceal catastrophic liabilities. Vance announced, addressing not just Julianne, but the entire room of watching investors. We do not participate in transactions flagged for active title fraud. He grasped the heavy pages of the contract in both hands. With a sudden, violent motion, he tore the document directly down the center. The sharp, ripping sound of the thick paper tearing echoed loudly through the silent ballroom. He tossed the shredded halves of the $5 million agreement onto the floor at Julianne's feet. "This acquisition is terminated effectively immediately," Vance commanded, turning his back on the ruined woman standing on the dais. The payoff was total and absolute. The Titan Development CEO had not merely walked away from the deal. He had publicly eviscerated Julianne's business acumen, exposed her gross negligence to her peers, and physically destroyed the lifeline she desperately needed to avoid financial ruin. He signaled to his legal team waiting near the front row of the audience, "We are leaving. Ensure our counsel files a formal notification regarding the misrepresentation of this asset by tomorrow morning." Vance strode down the steps of the dais, the crowd parting instantly to allow the furious executive to exit the ballroom. He did not look at Julianne again. He did not look at me. He simply walked out the heavy oak doors, taking the $5 million and Julianne's entire future with him. The security guard gripping my shoulder had released his hold entirely, stepping back with his hands raised in a gesture of non-interference. He, along with the rest of the private security team, realized they were no longer dealing with a trespasser. They were standing in the middle of a massive corporate detonation, and they wanted no part of the fallout. Julianne stood alone on the dais, bathed in the red light of the warning screens, staring down at the shredded contract resting on the polished floor. The silence in the ballroom shattered, replaced by a deafening roar of frantic whispers and shocked murmurs from the hundreds of guests who had just witnessed the spectacular public collapse of a fraudulent empire. The life Julianne had built on stolen funds and arrogant cruelty was over, and the true consequences were only just beginning to arrive. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind Richard Vance, sealing the fate of the Titan Development acquisition. The echo of the slamming doors seemed to act as a starter pistol for the ensuing chaos. The grand ballroom, previously a sanctuary of hushed, sophisticated networking, erupted into a cacophony of frantic, overlapping voices. Hundreds of wealthy investors, socialites, and corporate elites abandoned their polite facades, their faces contorted with shock, indignation, and a morbid fascination with the disaster unfolding before them. The shredded halves of the $5 million contract lay on the floor at Julianne's feet, a stark physical manifestation of her complete ruin. The pulsing red warning on the massive digital screens continued to cast an unforgiving crimson glare over the dais, a relentless digital heartbeat broadcasting the death of her empire. Julianne remained frozen, her eyes locked on the torn paper. She was trapped in the agonizing space between denial and the crushing realization that she had lost absolutely everything. Her breathing became shallow and erratic. The emerald silk of her designer gown trembled as the sheer terror finally overwhelmed her arrogant composure. At a table near the center of the ballroom, the shockwaves of the terminated deal hit a specific group of attendees with the force of a physical impact. 3 men wearing immaculate conservative dark suits stood up abruptly, abandoning their crystal glasses of champagne. They were not socialites or casual investors. They were representatives from the private equity firm that held the fraudulent $3 million mortgage on the estate. They had attended the gala to oversee the signing to ensure the $5 million transfer from Titan Development executed smoothly, allowing them to collect their principal and exorbitant interest without initiating foreclosure proceedings. They had expected a seamless, highly profitable transaction. Instead, they had just witnessed the complete collapse of their exit strategy. The lead representative pulled a sleek, encrypted communication device from his breast pocket. He did not attempt to quiet his voice or conceal his actions from the surrounding guests. The time for corporate discretion had evaporated the moment Richard Vance tore the contract in half. "The Titan acquisition is terminated," the representative barked into his device, his tone harsh and authoritative. The borrower failed to secure the ground lease and misrepresented the title status. The asset is fatally compromised. He paused, listening to the rapid instructions from his superiors on the other end of the line. He nodded sharply, his expression hardening into cold, unyielding resolve. "Execute the default protocols immediately," he ordered. "Trigger the asset freeze on all linked accounts. Initiate the seizure protocols for the commercial retail property on Oak Street. Lock the boutique down now." He severed the connection and looked directly at Julianne, who was still standing paralyzed on the dais. The representative did not issue a formal declaration or engage in a dramatic confrontation. He simply gave a swift tactical signal to his two associates, and the three men turned and strode purposefully toward the exit. They were initiating a ruthless, systemic financial execution. The private equity firm was moving to seize everything Julianne and her mother possessed, sweeping through their fabricated wealth with devastating speed. The reality of the default hit the room like a localized earthquake. The murmurs among the guests escalated into a chaotic roar. They realized they were not just attending a failed business transaction. They were standing inside an asset that was actively being seized by a predatory lending institution. The veneer of untouchable wealth surrounding the family was shattered permanently. A sharp, terrified shriek pierced the din of the ballroom. Aunt Pamela, who had been watching the scene unfold from a VIP table near the front, finally comprehended the magnitude of the disaster. She had orchestrated the forged signatures. She had facilitated the fraudulent loan to fund her daughter's lavish ambitions. She believed they were untouchable, protected by the sheer audacity of their crimes and the assumption that no one would dare question their authority. The realization that they were now entirely exposed, utterly bankrupt, and facing imminent federal prosecution for mortgage fraud struck her with devastating force. Pamela's face drained of all color, turning a sickly, translucent white. Her hands flew up to clutch her face, her carefully styled hair falling wildly around her shoulders. Her knees buckled completely. She collapsed onto the polished marble floor, her expensive evening gown pooling around her as she let out a series of ragged, hysterical sobs. "Julianne!" Pamela screamed, her voice breaking horribly. "The loan. The bank is going to take everything. They are going to find out what we did. We are going to prison." Her public breakdown confirmed the absolute worst suspicions of every guest in the room. She was not just mourning a lost sale. She was confessing to a catastrophic crime. The investors and socialites nearest to her scrambled backward, physically distancing themselves from the weeping woman as if her legal jeopardy were a contagious disease. The sound of her mother, hysterical sobbing, finally broke Julianne's paralysis. The shock shattered, replaced by a sudden, violent, and entirely unhinged rage. The carefully constructed persona of the elegant, powerful businesswoman vanished completely. The narcissistic illusion she had nurtured for years was gone, leaving only raw, vicious hatred, directed entirely at the person who had dismantled her life. She snapped her head around her eyes, locking onto me. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The veins in her neck pulsed visibly. She did not see a complex legal failure or the consequences of her own fraudulent actions. She only saw the target she believed was responsible for her destruction. "You." Julianne screamed a primal, guttural roar that echoed over the chaotic noise of the ballroom. "You ruined my life. You pathetic, jealous thief. You took everything from me." She did not wait for a response. The remaining shreds of her sanity evaporated. She lunged forward, kicking off her expensive high heels to gain traction on the polished floor. She charged down the steps of the dais, moving with a reckless, frenzied speed directly toward where I stood with Derek. Her hands curled into tight, aggressive fists, her fingernails digging into her palms. She intended to physically attack me to inflict whatever damage she could in a blind fit of vindictive rage. I did not retreat. I did not raise my arms defensively or scream for help. I maintained my ground, my posture rigid, watching her charge with cold, calculating detachment. I knew I was in absolutely no danger. The private security team, who had previously been ordered to remove me from the premises, instantly recognized the shifting threat dynamic. They were hired to maintain order and protect the high-profile guests from violence. A deranged, screaming woman charging through a crowded ballroom was an immediate liability, regardless of whether she was the individual who had initially signed their paychecks. Before Julianne could cross half the distance between us, the two large security guards who had escorted her earlier intercepted her path. They moved with swift, coordinated precision. The lead guard stepped directly in front of her, absorbing her momentum with his broad chest. Julianne slammed into him, screaming incoherently, flailing her arms in a desperate attempt to reach me. She clawed at his suit jacket, her eyes wild and unfocused. "Let me go!" she shrieked, thrashing violently against his hold. "I am going to kill her. Let me go." The second guard moved in behind her, securing her flailing arms and pulling them firmly behind her back. He applied a practiced restraining grip that instantly neutralized her ability to strike. Julianne let out a high-pitched wail of pure frustration, kicking her bare feet against the floorboards as she struggled vainly against the overwhelming physical force of the guards. "Ma'am, calm down immediately," the lead guard commanded, his voice a stern, authoritative bark that cut through her hysteria. "Stop resisting, or we will restrain you on the floor." Julianne did not calm down. The realization of her total helplessness, the loss of her physical autonomy, mirroring the loss of her financial empire, pushed her further into madness. She thrashed wildly, screaming obscenities, spittle flying from her lips as she fought the guards. The lead guard delivered a sharp nod to his partner. With a coordinated, forceful motion, the two men took Julianne down. They swept her legs out from under her, bringing her swiftly and decisively to the polished marble floor. They pinned her there, pressing her face down against the cold stone, effectively subduing her entirely. The grand, elegant ballroom descended into total anarchy. The wealthy guests gasped and shouted, pulling out their smartphones to record the unbelievable spectacle. The once untouchable heiress, the woman who had spent years parading her fabricated wealth and looking down upon the city elite, was now pinned to the floor by her own security team, screaming hysterically, while her mother wept uncontrollably a few feet away. I stood calmly amidst the chaos, the quiet eye of the storm. The red light from the projection screens continued to flash, illuminating the complete and total ruin of Pamela and Julianne. They had built a towering castle on a foundation of lies, cruelty, and stolen funds. I had not laid a hand on them. I had simply removed the ground they were standing on, and gravity had done the rest. The destruction was absolute, and the final crushing legal consequence was about to be delivered. The ballroom was engulfed in absolute pandemonium. The frantic murmurs of the wealthy guests had escalated into a chaotic roar of disbelief and morbid fascination. The brilliant flash of smartphone cameras illuminated the room as the city elite captured the catastrophic collapse of the family they had once courted. Julianne thrashed wildly against the polished marble floor, her screams muffled by the physical weight of the private security guards pinning her down. Her emerald silk gown was twisted and disheveled, mirroring the total ruin of the pristine image she had ruthlessly maintained. A few feet away, Pamela remained crumpled on the floor. Her hysterical sobs were harsh and jagged, tearing through the ambient noise like shattered glass. She clutched her head in her hands, her carefully styled hair completely undone, paralyzed by the realization that her fraudulent empire had imploded in front of hundreds of witnesses. The private equity representatives had already vanished into the night, initiating the asset freeze that would sever their final financial lifelines. The stage was set perfectly for the final act. We did not need to shout to establish our dominance over the wreckage. The sheer magnitude of the disaster spoke for itself. Derek moved with a calm, unhurried precision that contrasted sharply with the surrounding chaos. He did not rush. He did not look at the guests filming the spectacle, nor did he glance at the ruined women weeping on the floor. He maintained the rigid, unyielding posture of an executioner carrying out a formal sentence. He stepped up onto the elevated dais, moving past the abandoned silver fountain pen and the shredded halves of the $5 million purchase agreement. He stood directly in front of the ornate wooden table. The flashing red light from the massive digital screens cast a harsh, authoritative glow over his custom black tuxedo. He commanded the space, completely a stoic figure, anchoring the center of the storm. Derek reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. His movements were deliberate and highly visible to the watching crowd. He withdrew 2 thick, heavy envelopes printed on stark white premium legal stock. They were not invitations. They were declarations of war. He did not kneel down to hand the documents to Pamela, who was still weeping uncontrollably near the edge of the dais. He did not stoop to address a woman whose greed had blinded her to the consequences of her actions. Instead, he dropped the 2 envelopes flat onto the mahogany table. The heavy paper hit the wood with a sharp, definitive smack that somehow managed to cut through the cacophony of the ballroom. The sound drew Pamela attention. She slowly lifted her head, her face blotchy and stained with mascara. She stared at the pristine white envelopes resting on the table above her, her eyes widening in renewed terror. She understood that these documents represented the final crushing blow. Derek looked down at her. His expression was completely devoid of sympathy. He spoke, projecting his deep, resonant voice clearly across the room, ensuring that every recording smartphone captured the final judgment. This is the formal notice of eviction and demand for possession from Apex Holdings. Derek declared, his tone as cold and hard as polished steel. The chatter among the guests hushed immediately. The crowd strained to catch every word of the legal execution unfolding before them. The ground lease for this parcel and the commercial parcel occupying the boutique on Oak Street has been officially terminated due to gross violation of terms and unauthorized attempted transfer. Derek continued reciting the devastating legal reality with methodical clarity. You have lost all legal right to occupy these premises. Pamela let out a strangled, pathetic gasp, reaching a trembling hand toward the envelopes, but stopping inches away as if touching the paper would make the nightmare real. You have exactly 24 hours to vacate the structures situated on Apex Holdings land. Derek commanded, delivering the ultimatum without a trace of hesitation. You will remove all personal property from this estate and the retail location downtown. Any assets inventory or physical property remaining on the premises after the deadline expires will be considered abandoned and will be immediately seized by the corporation to offset the damages incurred by your fraudulent actions. He paused, letting the severity of the 24-hour deadline settle over the ruined woman. The sheer impossibility of packing a sprawling mansion and a fully stocked luxury boutique in a single day was intended. It was a final, undeniable demonstration of absolute control. They had given me until midnight to pack my life into a wet duffel bag. I was granting them the exact same courtesy. If you attempt to remain on the property past the designated hour, or if you attempt to further damage or alter the structures, Apex Holdings will pursue immediate federal prosecution for criminal trespass and destruction of corporate property. Derek concluded, his voice ringing with absolute finality. The authorities will not be called for a civil dispute. They will arrive to execute a felony arrest. Pamela stared at Derek, her mouth working silently. The devastating reality of the eviction notice crushed the last lingering ember of her denial. The house she had stolen, the luxury lifestyle she had funded through forgery and deceit, the legacy she had believed was secure, all of it was gone. She was not just bankrupt, she was homeless, and she had exactly 1 day to gather whatever scraps of her ruined life she could carry. She slumped forward, resting her forehead against the cold marble floor, her body shaking with fresh, hopeless sobs. She did not attempt to argue or negotiate. The power of the legal documents resting on the table above her was absolute and unassailable. Derek did not offer a closing remark. The documents had spoken. He turned his back on Pamela and the weeping, restrained Julianne and walked calmly down the steps of the dais to rejoin me. We stood together near the center of the ballroom, observing the profound devastation we had orchestrated. The flashing red screens continued to pulse their dire warnings against the walls, an unyielding digital monument to the true ownership of the land. The wealthy elite, the investors who had clinked glasses with Julianne mere hours ago, were already moving toward the exits. They were fleeing the toxic fallout of the ruined family, eager to distance themselves from the impending criminal investigations and the stench of absolute failure. The string quartet had long since packed their instruments and departed. The grand, opulent Gala had transformed into a sterile, unforgiving crime scene. I looked at Julianne, who was still pinned to the floor by the security guards she had hired to protect her. She had stopped screaming. Her face was pressed against the cold stone, her eyes wide and vacant, staring blankly at the shredded pieces of the $5 million contract resting a few feet away. The arrogance that had defined her entire existence had been entirely extinguished, replaced by the hollow, terrifying realization that she had authored her own destruction. I felt no pity for the women weeping on the floor. I felt no remorse for the swift, brutal execution of the eviction notice. I felt only the quiet, steady hum of absolute vindication. They had assumed my silence was a symptom of weakness. They had mistaken my compliance for submission. They had built an empire under the fatal assumption that I would never fight back. I had not raised my voice. I had not resorted to physical violence or desperate emotional pleas. I had simply waited for the perfect moment to deploy the irrefutable power of a legally binding contract. I had weaponized the very system they believed protected them, and I had used it to completely dismantle their reality. I turned away from the wreckage. Derek placed a protective hand on my lower back, and together we began the long walk across the empty expanse of the ballroom toward the heavy oak doors. We did not look back at the ruined family we left behind. The eviction notice was delivered, the ground was reclaimed, and the final crushing consequences were already rapidly approaching. The illusion was dead. The truth had reclaimed its throne. The 24-hour eviction deadline expired the following evening at exactly 9 o'clock. I sat in Natalie's quiet kitchen, nursing a cup of tea while Derek monitored the security feeds he had tapped into around the perimeter of the estate. The feeds showed a frantic, chaotic exodus. 2 rented moving trucks idled in the gravel driveway, while day laborers hired hastily and paid in cash haphazardly hauled furniture, clothing, and boxed inventory out of the main house. Pamela paced nervously near the gate, clutching a designer handbag, constantly checking her phone. Julianne was nowhere to be seen on the cameras, likely hiding inside, refusing to face the reality of her physical displacement. They vacated the premises entirely by 11 o'clock that night. The heavy wrought iron gates swung shut behind the last moving truck, sealing them out of the property forever. The eviction was complete. The ground belonged exclusively to me, but the physical removal was merely the opening act of a much larger systemic collapse. In the days that followed, the consequences of their fraudulent actions descended upon Julianne and Pamela with the sudden violent force of an avalanche. The private equity firm, incensed by the termination of the Titan Development acquisition and the revelation of the ground lease dispute, did not hesitate. They initiated aggressive legal action to recover their $3 million principal. Without the cash infusion from the sale, Julianne was entirely illiquid. She defaulted on the loan immediately. The default triggered a mandatory forensic audit by the private equity firm legal department. Derek and I monitored the public court dockets from his home office, watching the legal filings accumulate with breathtaking speed. It took the auditors less than 48 hours to scrutinize the collateral documents securing the mortgage. The discrepancy in my grandmother's signature, which Derek had identified instantly, did not escape the attention of the seasoned bank investigators. They subpoenaed the medical records from the hospital, establishing a concrete timeline that confirmed my grandmother was comatose during the exact period the mortgage documents were allegedly signed and notarized. The civil dispute over a defaulted loan instantly escalated into a severe federal criminal investigation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation formally opened a case file on Julianne and Pamela for mortgage fraud, wire fraud, and elder financial exploitation. The severity of the charges carried mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines that virtually guaranteed federal prison time if convicted. The local news outlets, tipped off by the spectacular public collapse at the Gala, picked up the story. The headlines were brutal, painting a portrait of a greedy family who had exploited a dying matriarch to fund a counterfeit luxury empire. The social fallout was immediate and absolute. The wealthy elite who had sipped champagne at Julianne Boutique, the investors who had applauded her fabricated success, vanished entirely. They severed all communication, terrified of being implicated in a federal fraud investigation. High society operates on proximity to power and wealth. The moment Julianne became a criminal liability, she was excised from their social circles with ruthless efficiency. They did not offer sympathy or support. They simply stopped returning her calls, abandoning her and Pamela to face the federal prosecutors alone. I watched the destruction unfold from a distance, feeling a profound sense of clinical detachment. I did not need to actively participate in their ruin. I did not need to file personal lawsuits or engage in petty, vindictive attacks. I had simply removed the foundation of their lies, and the immense pressure of the legal system they had attempted to manipulate was crushing them under its own weight. Their arrogance and their insatiable greed had engineered their downfall perfectly. A week after the Gala, my cell phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. The caller identification displayed the main directory number for the corporate logistics firm that had suspended me. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the quiet irony before answering. Sloane. The voice on the other end belonged to Evelyn, the director of human resources, who had coldly handed me my suspension notice. Her tone lacked the stern, authoritative edge she had wielded during our last encounter. It was cautious, hesitant, and laced with an uncomfortable, forced warmth. "I am listening, Evelyn," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. "We have been closely monitoring the recent developments regarding your family estate." Evelyn began carefully choosing her words to avoid admitting any corporate liability. "The news reports detailing the federal investigation into your cousin have clarified the situation considerably. It is now apparent that the allegations of theft and elder abuse directed at you were entirely fabricated." She paused, likely waiting for me to express relief or gratitude for their sudden realization of the truth. I remained silent, forcing her to endure the awkwardness of the admission. "The executive board has reviewed the circumstances, and we would like to formally apologize for the abrupt nature of your administrative suspension." Evelyn continued, her voice tightening slightly under the strain of delivering the mandated apology. "We recognize that you were the victim of a malicious smear campaign. We would like to immediately lift the suspension and invite you to return to your position as a compliance specialist. Your full back pay will be reinstated, of course." I looked out the window of Natalie Kitchen, watching the autumn leaves drift across the quiet suburban street. A month ago, losing that job had felt like a death sentence. The salary was my only lifeline, the sole means of keeping my head above water while drowning in student loan debt. I had begged them to verify the facts, to look past Julianne's fabricated phone call, and they had refused. They had discarded me to protect their corporate optics, assuming I was too weak and desperate to ever challenge their decision. They were attempting to invite me back into the fold, operating under the assumption that the destitute, frightened woman they had suspended would eagerly accept their apology and return to her cubicle. They did not know that the woman on the other end of the line was the executive controller of a multi-million-dollar real estate holding company. "I appreciate the phone call, Evelyn," I stated, my voice calm and devoid of any lingering resentment. "However, I will not be returning to the firm." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The refusal clearly caught her off guard. "Sloane, we understand you are upset, but we are offering full reinstatement. We value your expertise. You value compliance when it is convenient." I corrected her gently, my tone firm and uncompromising. "When an external party weaponized your human resources protocols to execute a personal vendetta, the firm chose the path of least resistance. You suspended me without conducting a rudimentary background check to verify the claims. You prioritized optics over due process." I let the silence hang for a moment, ensuring the weight of their institutional failure settled fully. "I require a work environment that operates on verified data and systemic integrity, not on the malicious rumors of angry relatives," I concluded. "Please mail my final paycheck and any accrued benefits to my current address. I will have my attorney forward you the forwarding details." I ended the call without waiting for a response. I set the phone down on the counter, feeling a profound, quiet satisfaction wash over me. The corporate logistics firm, Julianne Pamela, they had all relied on my perceived weakness. They had assumed my silence equated to submission. They had vastly underestimated the tactical patience required to endure an injustice until the perfect moment to strike. The avalanche had finally settled. The fraudulent empire was reduced to rubble. The perpetrators were facing federal prison, and the corporate entity that had abandoned me was permanently locked out of my life. I had navigated the storm without compromising my integrity, armed with nothing more than the irrefutable power of a legal document and the absolute certainty of my own worth. The past was entirely dismantled. It was time to build the future on solid ground. 6 months passed, and the dust from the corporate detonation finally settled over the Connecticut hills. The legal debris left behind by Julianne and Pamela was extensive, but the resolution of the property dispute was surprisingly swift. The predatory private equity firm realized they held a fraudulent mortgage on a physical structure resting on land they did not control. A mansion situated on an evicted ground lease is not a valuable asset. It is a stranded liability. Their aggressive lawyers attempted to threaten me with civil litigation, hoping to force a sale of the dirt to recover their lost capital. They did not succeed. Derek and I sat across from their lead counsel in a neutral boardroom downtown. We laid out the forensic timeline, the forged signatures, and the formal eviction notices. We explained the simple, unforgiving reality of property law. The bank faced a total financial loss. I offered them a fraction of their original principal to release the lien and surrender the physical structure to Apex Holdings. Driven by the need to mitigate their disastrous underwriting error, the firm accepted the offer. Apex Holdings acquired the physical estate for pennies on the dollar, settling the debt and uniting the bricks with the dirt. The property was whole again, and it belonged solely to me. Titan Development did not walk away quietly. Richard Vance called my personal cell phone 2 weeks after the ruined Gala. He offered a premium price 7 figures above the current market value to purchase the unified estate. He respected leverage, and he recognized I held all the cards. I listened to his pitch. I thanked him for his time. Then I declined the offer. I did not endure the storm, the humiliation, and the extortion, just to hand the territory over to another corporate conglomerate. The estate needed a purpose. My grandmother detested the superficial high society gatherings Pamela and Julianne had hosted. She preferred the quiet company of her rescue animals. I hired a specialized contracting crew to dismantle the opulent imported Italian marble foyer Julianne had installed. We removed the crystal chandeliers and the frivolous luxury fixtures. We retrofitted the sprawling first floor and the extensive rear gardens into a state-of-the-art animal rescue facility. I named it the Eleanor Foundation. Buster is 13 years old now. His joints are stiff and his pace is slow. But every afternoon he walks out the front doors without a leash. He finds a soft patch of grass in the center of the expansive front lawn and lies down in the sun. He is safe. He will never again be locked in a cold loading dock or used as a pawn in a financial shakedown. He spends his final years watching over a sanctuary filled with animals who needed a safe place to land, just like we did. My professional life required a similar reconstruction. I did not seek employment at another logistics firm. Working under executives who prioritized public relations over integrity held no appeal. Instead, Derek, Natalie, and I formed an independent consultancy. We named it Apex Forensic Compliance. Derek handles the intricate financial auditing. Natalie manages the operational logistics and client intake. I oversee contract compliance and legal strategy. We do not work for large corporations looking to cut corners. We represent vulnerable clients. We audit complex trusts, investigate elder financial exploitation, and dismantle predatory lending schemes. Last month, we represented an elderly man whose son attempted to siphon his pension using a fabricated power of attorney. We deployed the exact same tactical playbook we used against Julianne. We froze the assets, audited the historical transfers, and handed the unarguable evidence over to the state authorities. Our firm thrives because we understand the precise mechanics of fraud, and we know exactly where arrogant people hide their mistakes. It is a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The air carries the crisp, sharp scent of fallen leaves and incoming rain, a scent that reminds me of the night I was thrown out into the storm. I am standing on the wraparound porch of the main house. I wear a simple wool sweater and dark denim. I hold a mug of hot black tea. The environment is entirely peaceful. The sounds of barking dogs and the steady hum of the sanctuary staff have replaced the hollow, echoing chatter of wealthy investors. I look down the long gravel driveway. The heavy wrought iron gates at the entrance are closed and securely locked. A polished brass plaque rests on the stone pillar, displaying the name of the foundation. People often misunderstand the nature of vindication. Society teaches us that justice requires a dramatic confrontation, a screaming match, or a vindictive campaign to destroy the people who wronged us. We are conditioned to believe that retaliation must be loud and destructive. That is an amateur perspective. True power is profoundly quiet. I did not destroy my aunt and my cousin. I did not orchestrate their federal indictments or force them to sign a fraudulent loan. Their own unchecked entitlement and insatiable greed authored every single chapter of their ruin. They built a towering structure on a foundation of deceit, assuming the world would simply bow to their demands. When the authorities seized their assets and the high society elite shunned them, it was merely the natural consequence of their own choices. My only action was refusing to be their collateral damage. I learned that the most lethal weapon in any conflict is not volume or physical aggression. It is a meticulously drafted legal document. It is a notarized signature. It is the unyielding boundary of a commercial ground lease. Emotional outbursts fade into memory, but the county recorder office maintains the chain of title forever. When you are targeted by toxic individuals, your initial instinct might be to fight them in the mud. You might want to match their cruelty to prove your worth, to scream your truth until they finally hear you. Do not waste your breath or your energy. Narcissists and manipulators do not hear the truth. They only recognize threats to their control. The perfect retaliation is not found in their destruction. It is found in your own elevation. You secure your assets. You verify your documents. You stand firmly on your own territory, and you lock the heavy iron gates. You let the toxic elements rot on the outside, screaming at a wall that will never again yield to their demands. You build a life so secure and so grounded in reality that their lies can no longer touch you. I take a slow sip of my tea. The warm liquid counters the autumn chill in the air. Buster lets out a soft, contented sigh from his spot on the lawn, his golden fur catching the fading sunlight. I look at the dirt beneath my boots, the land my grandmother preserved with brilliant foresight, the empire I reclaimed with a single wax-sealed envelope. I am Sloane. I am an architect of compliance, and I am finally home. If you have ever been pushed out into the storm by the people who were supposed to protect you, I hope this story serves as your blueprint. Do not fight them in the rain. Find the paperwork, secure the ground, and lock the door. Have you ever used a hard fact to silence a manipulator in your own life? Tell me your strategy in the comments section below. I read every single one. If you found clarity in this journey, hit the like button, subscribe, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and turn on notifications for Hazel Tells Stories. Remember, true power does not shout. It simply signs its name. See you in the next story.